My father handed me a box wrapped in silver paper on my own front porch at 7:14 in the morning, kissed my forehead like he used to when I was 8 years old, and said 4 words I will never forget. Don't make a scene. Then he and my mother got into their car and drove away without looking back, leaving me standing barefoot on the cold concrete of my own doorstep in Charleston, South Carolina, holding a box that weighed exactly as much as a shoebox but felt, somehow, like it weighed 40 pounds. I want you to imagine that feeling. The one where your stomach already knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I opened it right there on the steps. Inside were 3 flash drives, a manila folder thick with documents, and a single burner phone with one saved contact labeled, "Call when ready." My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my coffee mug and it shattered against the brick, but I didn't even look down. I dialed 911 with fingers that didn't feel like mine anymore. If you're watching this from a city where the summer air smells like salt and magnolia, tell me in the comments because that's the last ordinary breath I ever took in that house. And then hit subscribe, because what happened in the next 11 minutes changed 4 families forever. My name is Camille Ashworth Whitfield. I was 34 years old, and for 6 years I had built my entire professional reputation on being the person other people hired when they suspected someone was stealing from them. I was a forensic accountant, a partner at Merrow & Klein Financial Integrity Group, the kind of firm that corporations quietly call when a number doesn't add up and nobody wants a scandal in the press. I traced hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands for a living. I found shell companies buried under 4 layers of LLCs. I once found $11 million a hospital administrator had funneled into his brother-in-law's dental practice, disguised as equipment maintenance. I was good at my job. I was, by every professional measure, one of the sharpest financial minds in the state of South Carolina. And yet, for 3 years, I had been married to a man who was stealing from me in my own house, and I hadn't seen it, because I never once thought to audit the person sleeping next to me. There were 3 things I did not know on the morning that box arrived on my porch. 3 separate threads that had been quietly unraveling behind my back for longer than I want to admit. The first was buried inside that manila folder, a spreadsheet, printed in my father's careful block handwriting at the top, tracking $412,000 that had moved out of our joint investment account over the previous 18 months, routed through something called the Sable Point Growth Trust, a name I had never heard my own husband say out loud. Not once, not at dinner, not in bed, not during a single one of our Sunday morning conversations about our 5-year plan. The second thread was on one of those flash drives, a folder of photographs time-stamped across 14 months, showing my husband, Marcus Whitfield, standing far too close to a 26-year-old woman named Bianca Reyes outside a condominium on Sullivan's Island that I did not know he owned. And the third thread, the one that would not surface until nearly 3 weeks later, was a single document buried in a county courthouse 2 states away in Nevada, a marriage certificate dated 9 years before our own wedding day, listing Marcus Whitfield as the groom and a woman named Danielle Farrow Whitfield as the bride, with no divorce decree ever filed. My husband was, as far as the state of Nevada was concerned, already married. I would spend the next 4 months confirming, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, lie by lie, that the man I had built a life with had built an entire second architecture underneath mine, and that his family, every single one of them, had helped him pour the foundation. To understand how I missed it, you have to understand how the Whitfield family operated, because they did not operate like normal people, and it took me years inside that family to realize the performance was the entire point. Marcus and I met at a charity auction for the Medical University of South Carolina, the kind of event where a single table costs $12,000 and half the room is there for the open bar and the other half is there to be seen writing checks they cannot actually cash. Marcus was 31 then, tall, tan in that specific low-country way, wearing a navy blazer with a crest on the pocket that belonged to a yacht club his family had technically resigned from 4 years earlier over an unpaid dues dispute nobody discussed. He introduced himself as Marcus Whitfield, of the Whitfield family, as if the second half of that sentence explained the first, and in Charleston society, it almost did. The Whitfields had once owned 300 acres of indigo and rice land outside the city, a fact that Eleanor Whitfield, my future mother-in-law, mentioned within the first 4 minutes of every single conversation she ever had with a stranger, usually followed by a small, practiced laugh, as though the acreage were a joke she was gracious enough to let you in on. What she never mentioned, what none of them ever mentioned, was that the land had been sold off in pieces, across 3 generations, to cover gambling debts, a failed restaurant venture, and, in Richard Whitfield's case, a failed marina development in the early 2000s that had gone underwater, literally and financially, when a hurricane took out the pilings 11 months after the county approved the permits. By the time I met Marcus, the Whitfield name still opened doors in Charleston, but the Whitfield bank accounts did not open much of anything at all. I did not know that then. I knew that Marcus drove a black Range Rover, that he wore a Patek Philippe watch he told me had been his grandfather's, that he described his job as private wealth consulting in a way that was vague enough to sound impressive, and specific enough to sound legitimate. I know now that the watch was purchased 8 months before I met him, on a credit line his mother co-signed, and that private wealth consulting meant, at various points during our courtship, a failed attempt at selling life insurance, a 6-month stint managing his father's defunct marina paperwork, and finally, starting about a year before our wedding, something called Sable Point Capital Partners, an entity Marcus told everyone, including me, was a boutique investment advisory firm he had built from the ground up. I believed him. I believed him because I loved him, and because I had spent my entire career learning to read financial statements and somehow never thought to apply that same scrutiny to the man across the breakfast table, and because, frankly, believing him was easier than the alternative, which was admitting that the fairy tale I had been sold at that charity auction had holes in it big enough to walk through. We married on a Saturday in April at St. Philip's Episcopal Church, 180 guests, a reception at the Country Club of Charleston that Richard Whitfield insisted on hosting, though I would later learn my own father quietly paid for 40% of it after a vendor called our house directly, panicking because the deposit check from the Whitfield side had bounced twice. My father never told me that at the time. He simply wrote a check and said nothing, the way he always did, the way that would matter enormously later, because my father, Judge Harold Ashworth, retired now from the federal bench after 22 years, was a man who believed that information was a weapon you kept sheathed until the exact moment it would do the most damage, and not 1 second before. My mother, Patricia Ashworth, had spent 18 years as an assistant United States attorney before she left the practice to raise my brother and me, and between the two of them, my parents had put away drug traffickers, dismantled a Ponzi scheme that had gutted a church congregation's retirement savings, and once, memorably, testified in a case that sent a sitting state senator to federal prison for wire fraud. I grew up in a house where dinner conversation revolved around chain of custody and burden of proof. I grew up watching my father explain to me, at age 11, why you never confront a suspect with everything you have all at once. Because the moment they know what you know, they start destroying what you don't have yet. I grew up, in other words, being trained my entire childhood for exactly the kind of war I did not realize I was about to fight, and it would take my own parents showing up on my porch with a wrapped box to remind me that everything I needed to survive this had been taught to me before I turned 12. Eleanor Whitfield, my mother-in-law, was 61 years old when I married her son, and in 6 years I never once heard her admit she was wrong about anything. Not about a recipe, not about a parking space, not about the state of her own family's finances. Arrogance was not a trait Eleanor occasionally displayed. It was the entire architecture of her personality, the load-bearing wall of everything she said and did. At my own wedding shower, hosted at her house on Trad Street, a house she rented, though she referred to it always as the family home, Eleanor stood at the head of the table and told 40 women, several of whom I worked with professionally, that I was a lovely addition, even if accounting isn't quite what we imagined for Marcus, as if I had married beneath the family station by bringing an actual verifiable income into the marriage. She said it smiling. She said most things smiling, which made the cruelty harder to name in the moment and easier to explain away afterward. To myself, in the car, on the drive home, the way I explained away so many small cuts over 6 years because each one on its own seemed too petty to be worth a fight. Richard Whitfield, my father-in-law, was 64, silver-haired, permanently tanned from a golf habit he could no longer technically afford but refused to give up, and if Eleanor's fixed trait was arrogance, Richard's was a bottomless, breathtaking entitlement, the quiet and total assumption that resources existed to be used by him regardless of whose name was on the account. Richard was the first person, 8 months into my marriage, to ask to borrow money from Marcus and me, $11,000 for what he called a bridge on the marina project, a project I would later discover had been legally dead for over a decade. He asked for it the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt, no embarrassment in his voice at all, and when I hesitated, just for a second, he looked at me with genuine, wounded confusion, as if I had violated some rule of the universe he assumed I already understood. The rule being that Whitfield money and Ashworth money were now the same pool, and he was entitled to swim in it whenever he pleased. We gave him the money, Marcus insisted. It was the first of what I would later calculate, sitting at my dining room table 18 months later with a legal pad and a calculator, to be over $160,000 in loans, to Richard Whitfield alone, none of it ever repaid, none of it ever even acknowledged as a debt in any conversation that followed. Priscilla Whitfield Dane, Marcus's younger sister, was 29, and her fixed trait was a particular blend of laziness dressed up as ambition, the kind of person who described herself as building a personal brand for 4 straight years without ever producing anything you could point to as evidence of labor. She had 11,000 followers on an account where she posted photographs of coffee cups and quotes about manifestation, and she referred to this, unironically, at every family dinner as my business. Priscilla had been given a monthly stipend by her parents since college, a stipend that, once her parents' own funds thinned out, began quietly coming from Marcus, and I would later discover, from me, from an account with my name on it, $1,200 a month for brand development. Money that, as far as I could ever determine, went almost entirely toward a rotating series of handbags and a personal trainer named Dax. Priscilla was married to a man named Colton Dane, who worked, when he worked, in commercial real estate, and the two of them lived in a house on Wentworth Street that Richard had technically co-signed and that Priscilla referred to, at every opportunity, as evidence that she and Colton were doing so well, a phrase that always made my mother-in-law beam with pride and made me, increasingly, want to ask for the actual mortgage statement. And then there was Bianca Reyes, 26 years old when I finally learned her name from a folder of photographs on a flash drive, though I had, without knowing it, met her twice before that morning. She had been introduced to me at a Sable Point holiday party the previous December as Marcus's associate, a slim woman with dark hair and an easy laugh who had complimented my dress and asked thoughtful questions about my work. Questions I now understand, in hindsight, were not curiosity but reconnaissance. Bianca's fixed trait, the one that would repeat itself in every interaction I would later piece together from receipts, texts, and hotel records, was opportunism, a pure and almost admirable efficiency in taking whatever was offered and asking for more the moment it was given. She had started as Marcus's part-time office assistant at Sable Point 18 months into our marriage, been promoted to Director of Client Relations within 4 months despite Sable Point having, as far as I could ever verify, exactly 6 actual clients, and had moved into a 1-bedroom condo on Sullivan's Island 11 months before that box arrived on my porch, a condo whose deed, when my father eventually pulled it, listed the owner not as Bianca Reyes but as the Sable Point Growth Trust, the same entity that had quietly siphoned $412,000 out of my joint account with Marcus over the previous 18 months. I want to walk you through exactly how a woman who audits fraud for a living can live inside a fraud for 3 years without seeing it, because I think about this every single day, and because I think it matters more than the money, more than the affair, more than any of it. It is not that I was stupid. It is that Marcus understood something about deception that most amateur liars never grasp. The goal is not to hide the truth completely. The goal is to make the truth boring. Every time I asked a question about Sable Point's finances, Marcus had an answer ready within half a second, delivered with the mild, faintly bored tone of a man explaining something he assumed I already understood, a tone that implied my question itself was slightly beneath the conversation. It's a capital call, it's normal, every fund does it. It's a K1 timing issue, my accountant is handling it. It's just how illiquid assets work, Cam, you know this. He used my own professional vocabulary against me, borrowed words from conversations I'd had with him about other people's fraud cases, and fed them back to me reshaped just enough to explain away his own numbers. I had caught $11 million embezzlement schemes built by hospital CFOs with law degrees, and I had missed a $400,000 theft happening 18 inches from where I slept, because the hospital CFO was a stranger I approached with suspicion, and Marcus was my husband, and I had extended him a form of credit I would never, ever have extended to a stranger. The assumption of good faith. There were signs, of course. There are always signs, and the cruelest part of hindsight is realizing how many of them you filed away as nothing. 8 months before the box arrived, I noticed Marcus had started taking calls in the garage instead of the kitchen, standing beside his Range Rover with the door open, gesturing with his free hand the way he did when he was trying to convince someone of something. 5 months before the box, I found a charge on our joint card for $620 at a jewelry store on King Street that Marcus explained was a gift for my mother's birthday. A birthday that, when it arrived 3 weeks later, produced no visible jewelry on Eleanor at all. 3 months before the box, Marcus began sleeping in the guest room for his back, a back that had never once bothered him in 3 years of marriage. 2 months before the box, I woke up at 2 a.m. to find him in the kitchen on a video call, and when I walked in, he closed the laptop so fast the corner caught the edge of the counter and left a small dent I can still find if I run my thumb along that spot today. Each of these, alone, was nothing. A tired husband, a forgotten birthday gift, a sore back, a late-night work call. I am a professional forensic accountant, and the entire discipline of my job is understanding that fraud is never one transaction. It is a pattern, and you only ever see the pattern once you stop looking at the individual entries and start looking at the whole ledger. I had spent 3 years reading the individual entries of my own marriage and calling each one, in isolation, forgivable. My parents, it turned out, had been reading the whole ledger for almost a year before I ever suspected a thing, and they had done it without saying a single word to me, because that was who they were, and because, as my father would later explain, sitting across from me at his kitchen table with the manila folder between us, we didn't want to hand you an accusation, Camille. We wanted to hand you proof, it began, my mother told me, at a 4th of July gathering at the Whitfield family lake house, a house Richard had described to my parents as ours, obviously, going back 3 generations, a claim my mother, out of a lifetime habit she could not turn off even at a barbecue, quietly fact-checked 2 days later using the county property records website, and discovered the lake house had in fact been purchased 11 years earlier by a limited liability company, and that the LLC's registered agent was a law firm my mother recognized, from her prosecutor days, as one that specialized in asset protection for people anticipating litigation. That single search led to another and then another. Over the following 10 months, my parents building a case the way my father had built cases for 2 decades on the bench, quietly, patiently, corroborating everything twice before writing it down once, until they had $412,000 traced through 11 transactions. A Nevada marriage certificate with no divorce decree, a condo deed in a trust name, and photographs a private investigator my mother hired. A woman named Deborah Okafor, who specializes exclusively in financial infidelity cases, had taken over 14 months outside a building on Sullivan's Island. The morning the box arrived, the 2 police officers who walked into my kitchen 22 minutes after my 911 call were not, as I initially assumed, there to investigate a burglary or a domestic disturbance. They were there because my mother, before she and my father drove off, had already placed a call to a detective she'd worked with for 11 years during her time as a federal prosecutor, a man named Detective Roy Falcone of the Charleston County Financial Crimes Unit, and had told him, in essence, that her daughter was about to discover evidence of active, ongoing fraud, and that the discovery needed a documented, official witness the moment it happened, so that nothing about the timeline could ever be questioned later. That is who Officer Falcone was, in my kitchen, in uniform, standing beside a younger officer named Reyes. No relation to Bianca, a coincidence that would make me laugh out loud, badly, hysterically, 3 hours later, in a way that scared me. I had barely finished explaining what was in the box, my voice cracking on the word Nevada, when I heard the garage door open, the specific mechanical groan it made that I had heard 1,000 times and never once found ominous before that second, and Marcus walked into his own kitchen, loosening his tie, calling out, "Cam, whose cruiser is that in the—" And then he stopped in the doorway, and I watched every trace of color drain out of his face in real time, watched him look at Officer Falcone, then at me, then at the manila folder open on the counter with my father's handwriting visible from across the room. And he said the sentence that I have replayed in my head more times than I can count, the sentence that told me, with total certainty, that this was not a misunderstanding, this was not a mistake, this was a man who had been living for years with the specific, cold awareness that a day like this might come. Please don't tell me they actually did it. Not did what, not who did what. He knew exactly what it was. He knew who they were. In 4 words, my husband confirmed every single thing my parents had spent nearly a year proving. Confirmed it to 2 police officers in his own kitchen, 11 minutes into what should have been an ordinary Tuesday. I did not scream. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you're expecting me to have screamed, to have thrown the coffee mug that was already in pieces on the porch, to have collapsed into some cinematic grief on my kitchen floor. I did not do any of that. Something in me went very, very still and very, very cold, the same stillness I feel when I sit down with a company's ledger and start finding the first 3 fraudulent entries, the recognition that the puzzle is real, and now the only question is how deep it goes. I looked at Marcus and I said, "Sit down," and my voice came out flat and level, and I watched something in his face flicker, a flash of confusion, because I don't think, in 6 years, he had ever seen that particular version of me, the version that stops being a wife and starts being an auditor. Over the following 4 months, I built a case the way I had built 40 other cases in my career, except this time, the subject was my own marriage, my own bank accounts, my own life laid out on my dining room table under a desk lamp at 11 p.m., while Marcus slept in the guest room, unaware of exactly how much I already knew and unwilling to ask, because asking would require admitting there was something to ask about. I pulled 18 months of bank statements for the joint account. I traced every wire transfer to Sable Point Growth Trust, cross-referencing dates against the calendar on my own phone, and found a pattern so precise it made my hands shake the first time I saw it laid out. Every single transfer, without exception, occurred within 72 hours of a deposit clearing from my own bonus checks or client settlement distributions, as though the account had been designed, quite literally, to skim off the top of my income the moment it landed, before I would even think to check the balance. $412,000, moved in 11 transfers over 18 months, an average of just over $37,000 per transfer, each one below the $50,000 threshold that would have triggered additional compliance review at our bank, a threshold Marcus knew about. I would later confirm, because I had explained it to him myself, at dinner, 11 months earlier, while telling him about a fraud case I was working on that involved exactly that kind of structuring. I requested the full corporate filing history for Sable Point Capital Partners from the South Carolina Secretary of State, and found that it had been registered not as an investment advisory firm, which would have required registration with the SEC or state securities regulators depending on assets under management, but as a generic LLC, Management Consulting Services, a classification that let Marcus operate for 2 years without ever filing a single disclosure document, without ever being audited, without ever being required to prove that a single dollar he claimed to be investing on behalf of clients was going anywhere except into an account he controlled personally. I pulled the client list, which existed only as a spreadsheet Marcus kept on a shared drive I still, mistakenly, had access to, and found 6 names, 4 of them relatives of Whitfield family friends, elderly women in their 70s and 80s who had each been persuaded to move a portion of their retirement savings into the Sable Point Growth Fund, a fund that did not exist as any registered investment vehicle anywhere, a fund whose statements, I would discover, Marcus generated himself using a template he'd built in Excel, complete with a fabricated logo and fabricated year-over-year returns that consistently beat the S&P 500 by exactly 4 to 6 percentage points every single quarter. A level of suspiciously smooth outperformance that would have been the first red flag in any legitimate audit, and that none of these women, trusting him because they trusted his family name, had ever thought to question. $890,000. That was the number I arrived at on a Tuesday night in late August, sitting alone at my dining room table, when I finally totaled the elderly client's losses alongside my own. $890,000 that Marcus Whitfield had taken from 6 trusting people and his own wife over roughly 2 years. And as I sat there staring at that number on my laptop screen, I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that this was no longer a marriage that had gone wrong. This was a federal crime that happened to be wearing a wedding ring. I want to tell you about the dinner at Eleanor's house 3 weeks after I found that $890,000 number, because it is the clearest example I can give you of how I learned to live a double life of my own during those 4 months. Smiling at a family I was actively building a federal case against, and it is also the clearest example of exactly what I mean when I say Eleanor's fixed trait. Her arrogance, never once cracked, not even slightly, not even when the walls around her were already, unbeknownst to her, on fire. Eleanor had insisted on a family dinner to discuss what she called wedding planning, because Priscilla and Colton had, in a stroke of timing so absurd I nearly laughed out loud when the invitation came, just announced they were renewing their vows for their 5th anniversary. A lavish event Eleanor wanted hosted at the same yacht club her family had technically been asked to leave years earlier over unpaid dues. Dues which, I now knew from the financial trail, had eventually been quietly paid off using $11,000 of the money Richard had borrowed from Marcus and me 2 years prior. I sat at that table, a untouched glass of Sancerre in front of me, and I listened to Eleanor explain, at length, unprompted, why the vow renewal absolutely required a raw bar, because anything less says something about a family, Camille, and we are not that kind of family. And I thought about the 6 elderly women whose retirement savings had funded exactly this kind of appearance, for exactly this kind of family, and I said nothing, and I smiled, and I passed the bread basket. Because I had learned, in 4 months, that the version of me who said nothing and gathered information was infinitely more dangerous to this family than the version of me who screamed. Eleanor asked me, halfway through the meal, apropos of nothing, whether my little firm might be willing to sponsor a table at the renewal event, since you all do so well, a request delivered with the exact same smiling entitlement she had used at my own wedding shower to describe my career as beneath the family's station, and I watched her, in real time, pivot from dismissing my profession to requesting money from it within the space of a single dinner, without any apparent awareness of the contradiction, and I understood, watching her, that Eleanor did not actually see me at all. She saw a category. I was, to Eleanor, Marcus's wife, the one with the job. An entry in a ledger of family assets, useful in proportion to what I could provide, and irrelevant beyond that. It is astonishing, once you see a person clearly for the first time, how much of the previous 6 years snaps into focus retroactively. How many small comments reorganize themselves from confusing into obvious. The second scene with Eleanor that I want you to have, the one that confirmed everything, happened 4 days later when I happened to stop by the Whitfield house on Trad Street to return a serving dish, a visit I had actually engineered because I wanted to see with my own eyes whether Eleanor knew about Bianca, whether the fixed arrogance of this family extended all the way down into active complicity. I found Eleanor in her kitchen on the phone, and because her hearing had never been what it once was, she did not lower her voice when I let myself in through the side door the way I always had. I heard her say, clear as anything, well, he has to be discreet about it, obviously. That's simply not something you discuss at dinner. But I've told Marcus 100 times, appearances matter more than accuracy, darling. They always have. I stood in that hallway for 11 seconds, not moving, and then I knocked loudly on the doorframe as though I had just arrived. And Eleanor turned, smiling instantly, seamlessly, and said, Camille, what a lovely surprise, with absolutely no trace of the conversation I had just overheard visible anywhere on her face. That was Eleanor. Arrogance so complete it did not require concealment, because in Eleanor's mind, she had done nothing wrong. She had simply prioritized the family's appearance over an inconvenient truth. And to Eleanor, that was not deception, that was management. Richard's 2 scenes were, if anything, easier to collect, because entitlement, unlike arrogance, does not even bother to perform politeness once it senses an opening. The first came 6 weeks into my investigation, when Richard called me directly, not Marcus, me, to ask whether I could advance him $9,000 for what he described as a small cash flow gap before the quarter closes, a phrase so vague it could have meant anything. And when I asked, gently, what the money was actually for, Richard's tone shifted instantly from casual to wounded, the exact same wounded confusion I remembered from the Marina Bridge loan 3 years earlier. And he said, Camille, I didn't realize we needed to file a formal request now. I thought we were past that, As though my hesitation to hand over $9,000 unquestioned was a violation of some understanding I had never actually agreed to. I told him I would need to discuss it with Marcus, and I hung up, and I wrote the exact date and time in a notebook I had started keeping, a habit from my professional life I had never expected to apply to my own father-in-law. The second Richard scene happened at a Whitfield family cookout in September, 10 days before everything came apart in public, when Richard cornered me by the cooler, a beer in each hand, and told me, unprompted, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone he considered family, that he'd been thinking Marcus and I really ought to consider putting his name on the deed to our lake house rental for the summer. For tax purposes, obviously, you'd understand that better than me. A suggestion that was, on its face, both financially illiterate and staggeringly presumptuous, and that Richard delivered with the same relaxed certainty he might use to ask someone to refill his drink. I said I'd think about it. I did not think about it. I wrote it down. Priscilla's 2 scenes reinforced a different flavor of the same rot. The laziness dressed as ambition, the assumption that effort was for other people. The first was a lunch in early September where Priscilla spent 40 minutes describing her plans to scale her brand into a lifestyle empire, plans that, when I gently asked what her actual next concrete step was, dissolved instantly into vague references to manifesting the right energy and waiting for the universe to align the partnership. Language she had, I would later learn, lifted almost verbatim from a podcast she listened to on her 20-minute drive to a personal training session she did not pay for herself. She asked at the end of that lunch whether Marcus and I might be willing to invest $15,000 into her brand as seed funding, framing it not as a loan or a gift but as an investment, complete with a vague promise of equity in a business that, as far as I could ever determine, consisted of an Instagram account and a half-finished website template. The second Priscilla scene happened the week before the vow renewal, when I found her in the Whitfield laundry room, on her phone, complaining to a friend, not realizing I was in the hallway, about how exhausting it was to plan the renewal practically by myself, a claim that was, I knew for a fact, false, because I had personally coordinated the caterer, the florist, and the string quartet after Priscilla missed 2 consecutive deadlines with vendors who had called me directly, panicking, the same way vendors had called my parents' house panicking about the wedding deposit 6 years earlier. Priscilla did not do the work. Priscilla described doing the work, extensively, to anyone who would listen, and somewhere along the way, in that family, the description had become functionally indistinguishable from the labor itself. Bianca's 2 scenes were the ones that cost me the most to collect, because collecting them meant, for the first time, seeing the actual texture of my husband's second life, rather than just its financial shadow. The first came from Deborah Okafor's surveillance file, a photograph time-stamped 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday in June, showing Marcus and Bianca on the balcony of the Sullivan's Island condo, Marcus's hand resting at the small of Bianca's back in a gesture so casual, so practiced, that it told me instantly this was not a new development, this was routine. This was a Thursday like every other Thursday for over a year. The second scene I did not need surveillance for at all, because I lived it myself, 3 weeks before the box arrived. At a Sable Point client appreciation event, Marcus had insisted I attend for appearances, where Bianca introduced herself to me for what she pretended was the second time, complimenting my earrings, asking pointed, well-informed questions about forensic accounting methodology that I now recognize were her testing exactly how close I might be to the truth, gauging my knowledge the way a burglar might jiggle a doorknob before deciding whether to break the window. Opportunism, pure and efficient, gathering information even in the act of flirting with danger. Because Bianca, more than any of them, understood that proximity to Marcus's money was worth the risk of proximity to me. The Nevada marriage certificate took the longest to confirm, because Marcus had been, in this one specific area, more careful than anywhere else. Careful in a way that told me, once I understood it, that this was the secret he feared most. More than the fraud, more than Bianca, the one thing that would not just end our marriage but retroactively erase it. My father found the initial record through a contact he still had from his years on the federal bench, a court clerk in Clark County, Nevada, who confirmed, off the record at first and then through a certified copy, my father requested formally, that Marcus Allen Whitfield had married a woman named Danielle Renee Farrow at a chapel on the Las Vegas Strip on March 3rd, 9 years and 2 months before Marcus married me, and that no divorce decree, no annulment, no dissolution filing of any kind existed anywhere in the Clark County or South Carolina court systems under either of their names. My mother, using the investigative instincts she had never fully retired, tracked down Danielle Farrow herself, now living in Reno under her maiden name, and made contact, carefully, respectfully, explaining only that she was researching a legal matter connected to a man Danielle had once known. Danielle, it turned out, had spent 9 years believing she and Marcus had been quietly divorced through paperwork Marcus swore he'd filed himself back when they split after 8 chaotic months together in their early 20s. Paperwork Danielle had never personally seen, had never personally signed, had simply trusted Marcus to handle. The exact same trust, I realized with a cold jolt, that I had extended him for 3 years regarding Sable Point. Marcus had a pattern. He found women willing to hand him administrative control over the parts of their lives that mattered most. And then he simply never did the paperwork, because undone paperwork left him doors that other people believed were closed. This meant, functionally, legally, that my 6-year relationship with Marcus, our engagement, our wedding at St. Philip's, our 3 years as husband and wife, had never actually been a legal marriage at all, because Marcus was never free to marry me in the first place. I sat with that fact for 3 full days before I told anyone, even my parents, because it did something strange to my sense of time, made me question every anniversary, every joint tax return, every moment I had described myself, out loud, to strangers as my husband's wife. I had spent 3 years as, legally, nothing to this man. A woman living in a house with someone else's husband, unknowingly, while he built a fraud on the foundation of my trust and a second family, or at minimum a second relationship serious enough to include a shared address, 60 feet from our own front door in social distance, and infinitely farther in every other sense. If you are still watching this, if any part of what I've described so far resonates with something you've lived through, whether it's a financial betrayal or a personal one, I want you to comment the word ledger below, because that is exactly what I started calling this investigation in my own head, my ledger, the record I was building line by line, and I promise you the reckoning is coming. If this story is holding you the way I hope it is, hit subscribe now, because what I'm about to tell you about the 6 weeks between confirming that marriage certificate and the night of Priscilla's vow renewal is the part where I stopped simply documenting what had been done to me and started deciding what I was going to do about it. The 6 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, because I learned to live two completely separate lives inside the same body, the way, I now understood, Marcus had been doing for years. By day, I was a wife, planning to attend her sister-in-law's vow renewal, RSVPing to seating charts, approving a menu, complimenting Priscilla's dress choice at a fitting I attended purely to maintain appearances. By night, at my dining room table, under that same desk lamp, I was building a criminal referral packet with my father, who walked me through exactly how federal prosecutors think, what elements they need proven for wire fraud, what elements they need for securities fraud, what corroboration a case needs before an assistant United States attorney will even consider presenting it to a grand jury. My father had spent 22 years on the bench watching cases arrive complete or incomplete, and he was determined that whatever we handed to the authorities would be so thoroughly documented, so airtight, that no defense attorney, however skilled, could find a seam to pull. We assembled everything into 3 parallel tracks. The first track was the financial fraud, the $890,000 taken from me and from 6 elderly Sable Point clients, supported by 18 months of bank records, the fabricated fund statements Marcus had generated, the unregistered LLC filing, and sworn statements my mother had quietly, gently obtained from 2 of the elderly women, both of whom broke down crying on the phone with her. One of them, a widow named Marguerite Colby, telling my mother she had trusted Marcus specifically because he's a Whitfield, and Whitfields don't need to steal, a sentence that has stayed with me because it captures, perfectly, the entire mechanism by which this family's inherited reputation functioned as a weapon long after the money that built the reputation was gone. The second track was the bigamy, the undissolved Nevada marriage, which on its own was not necessarily a federal matter, but which mattered enormously for a different reason. It meant that every joint account, every asset titled in Marcus and Camille Whitfield, had been entered into under a marriage that was legally void, which meant, my father explained, that in the divorce and asset recovery proceedings that would follow, I would not be treated as a spouse dividing marital property. I would be treated, legally, as a victim recovering property that had never been rightfully commingled in the first place. An enormous distinction that would determine how much of what Marcus had taken I could actually get back. The third track, the one I insisted on personally, over my father's initial hesitation that it was not strictly necessary for the criminal case, was Bianca and the Sable Point Growth Trust condo. I wanted to know with total certainty whether Bianca had simply been a woman having an affair with a man who happened to be married, which would be sad but not criminal, or whether Bianca had been an active participant in the fraud itself, knowingly living in a property purchased with stolen retirement savings. Deborah Okafor found the answer within 9 days. Emails, obtained through a data recovery process on a laptop Bianca had briefly left unlocked at the Sable Point office during a fire drill. That laptop belonging technically to Sable Point Capital Partners and therefore, my father confirmed, not protected by the same privacy expectations Bianca's personal devices would have carried. In those emails, Bianca had not only known about the source of the condo's purchase funds, she had actively suggested the trust structure to Marcus as a way to keep the property off Camille's radar in case she ever gets nosy about the accounts. A phrase that told me everything I needed to know about how Bianca had assessed me for the entire duration of our acquaintance. Not as a person, but as a risk to be managed. Exactly the way Eleanor had assessed me as a resource to be managed. Exactly the way this entire family, by blood or by choice, seemed constitutionally incapable of seeing me as anything other than an obstacle or an asset. By the second week of October, we had a case file 11 inches thick, and my father drove it, personally, in a banker's box to the Charleston field office of the FBI, where he had a scheduled meeting with a special agent named Denise Okonkwo Marsh, who specialized in financial crimes and elder fraud. A meeting my father had spent 3 days arranging through channels that made clear, without him ever saying so directly, that a retired federal judge walking into a field office with a fully documented case still carries a particular kind of weight that an ordinary citizen's complaint does not. Agent Okonkwo Marsh spent 6 hours with the file that first day and called my father back within 72 hours to say that her office was opening a formal investigation, that the elder fraud angle alone, given the ages and vulnerability of the victims, made this a priority case, and that she would need me to come in for a formal interview, which I did. On a Wednesday morning, spending 4 hours in a windowless conference room, walking two agents through every transaction, every date, every document, answering questions with the same clinical precision I would use presenting findings to a corporate audit committee, because that clinical precision, I had discovered, was the only thing keeping me from falling apart in that room. What I did not know, what Agent Okonkwo Marsh could not tell me and would not have told me even if she could, was the exact timeline of when an arrest might happen, only that these things take the time they take, and that the worst thing I could do was tip Marcus off that federal agents were involved before the investigation reached the point where evidence could be secured and flight risk assessed. Which meant I had to keep living inside a marriage I now knew, legally, had never existed, sleeping down the hall from a man under active federal investigation, attending a vow renewal for his sister, funded partly by stolen money, smiling at his mother across a dinner table, all while carrying a piece of knowledge so large it felt, some nights, like it might actually crack my ribs from the inside. It was during this period, 3 weeks before the renewal, that I received a call from Agent Okonkwo Marsh informing me that the investigation had accelerated faster than anticipated, because the Bureau had cross-referenced the Sable Point Growth Trust against an existing watchlist flag. Danielle Farrow, the still legal Mrs. Whitfield in Nevada, had, unbeknownst to any of us, filed her own complaint 11 months earlier with Nevada authorities after discovering, through a credit monitoring alert, that a mortgage application had been filed in her still legally married name for a property in South Carolina she had never seen. A property that turned out, when the dates were cross-checked, to be the very same house Marcus and I lived in, meaning that somewhere in the loan paperwork for our own home, 7 years earlier, Marcus had used Danielle's continued legal status as his wife to secure more favorable financing terms he would not have qualified for on his own credit alone. Without her knowledge, without her signature on the actual documents, a forgery layered on top of an unresolved bigamy, layered on top of an active embezzlement scheme, each fraud quietly propping up the next, like a row of dominoes I had been living inside for 6 years, without ever seeing the first one fall. Agent Okonkwo Marsh's office had now connected our South Carolina fraud investigation with an active Nevada mortgage fraud complaint, and the combined weight of both, she explained to my father in a call I listened to on speakerphone, my hands wrapped so tightly around a coffee mug that the handle left a groove in my palm, meant the Bureau was now moving toward securing an arrest warrant, and that they wanted it executed publicly, at a moment where Marcus would have no opportunity to destroy remaining evidence or attempt to flee, and where, Agent Okonkwo Marsh added, almost gently, given the elder victims involved, and given how this family appears to have used its social standing to enable the fraud for years, there's value in the arrest happening somewhere that standing can't protect him. She did not tell me where or when. She did not need to. I already knew, the same way I think you already know, reading this, exactly which event on the calendar was about to become the place my entire life, and every Whitfield's carefully constructed appearance finally came apart in front of everyone who mattered to them. The vow renewal was set for the second Saturday in November at the Charleston Harbor Yacht Club, the very club the Whitfields had been asked to leave years before over unpaid dues. Dues Eleanor had spent 2 years quietly campaigning to have forgiven, through a combination of charm, name-dropping, and a strategically donated portrait of her late father-in-law that now hung, absurdly, in the club's main hallway. 210 guests were invited. Eleanor had insisted on an ice sculpture of a monogrammed W, a raw bar that alone cost $9,000, a string quartet flown in from Atlanta because the local quartet, Eleanor said, didn't have quite the right sound, and a videographer to capture the entire event for what she called, more than once, the family archive, a phrase that would prove darkly, almost comically ironic given what that archive was about to actually contain. The final 10 days before the event were the hardest of the entire ordeal, because I had to perform normalcy at a level of precision that exceeded anything I had done in the previous 4 months. I sat through a final dress fitting with Priscilla, holding pins in my mouth while she spun in front of a mirror, describing, yet again, how exhausted the planning had left her. I attended a seating chart meeting at Eleanor's house, where Eleanor explained, at length, why the Whitfields' oldest family friends needed to be seated closer to the head table than my own parents. Simply because they've known us longer, darling, it's not personal. a comment that 4 months earlier would have stung, and that now simply confirmed, one more time, exactly how little this family had ever actually seen me. I helped Marcus rehearse the toast he planned to give for his sister, standing in our kitchen while he practiced lines about family, loyalty, and choosing the people who choose you back. Lines I listened to with an expression I had, by this point, perfected into something between warmth and total blankness. A mask I had built specifically for him over 4 months. The same way, I now understood with a strange, cold symmetry, he had built one for me over 3 years. 2 nights before the event, Agent Okonkwo Marsh called my father directly to confirm the operational plan. The Bureau would have 2 plainclothes agents inside the venue, positioned as catering staff, and a marked unit and 2 additional agents staged outside, ready to move the moment a formal signal was given. The signal, we all agreed after considerable discussion, would be tied to a specific, unmistakable moment. Marcus's toast to his sister, the one he had been rehearsing in our kitchen, because it would put him at the microphone, at the center of the room, in front of every witness who mattered to this family's reputation. At a moment when there would be no ambiguity, no crowd noise loud enough to make the arrest look like anything other than exactly what it was. My parents arrived at the venue an hour before the ceremony began. My father in a charcoal suit, my mother in deep green, both of them moving through the crowd with the calm, unhurried presence of people who had walked into far more dangerous rooms than a yacht club ballroom. My father found me near the bar, squeezed my hand once, hard, and said only, "Don't make a scene, sweetheart. Let them make it for you." It was the same sentence he had said on my porch 4 months earlier, and this time I understood it completely. He was not telling me to stay quiet because I was weak, or because the truth needed softening. He was telling me the exact strategic lesson he had spent his entire career living by, the lesson I had absorbed as a child without knowing I would need it as an adult. The person who controls their reaction controls the room. And the moment you let your enemy see your rage, you have already handed them a script for how to survive it. I wore navy, not black, deliberately, a color that read as elegant and unremarkable in photographs, a color that would not, later, be described in any headline as "widow at a wedding." I stood near the back of the room during the ceremony itself, watching Priscilla and Colton renew vows neither of them, I now suspected from 6 months of financial records showing Colton's own quietly mounting debts, entirely believed in anymore. Watching Eleanor dab at dry eyes with a handkerchief she had clearly practiced with in a mirror. Watching Richard beam at the assembled crowd of exactly the kind of people whose approval he had spent his entire adult life chasing and never quite affording. And I watched Marcus, at the head table, laughing easily with his father, entirely unaware that in less than 90 minutes, 2 federal agents disguised as waitstaff would be standing 11 feet from where he stood, waiting for him to open his mouth. The dinner service moved with the particular, unhurried rhythm of an event that has cost too much money to rush. I ate almost nothing. I remember the specific sensation of the raw bar's ice sculpture slowly weeping onto the white tablecloth beneath it, over the course of the evening, a small detail my mind fixed on obsessively. The way melting evidence disappears drop by drop until there is nothing left to prove it was ever solid at all. And I remember thinking, watching it, that this entire family's fortune had been melting in exactly that same slow, quiet way for 3 generations, and that tonight, finally, everyone in this room was about to see the puddle. At 8:52 p.m., the bandleader announced that Marcus Whitfield would say a few words for his sister, and I watched my husband rise from the head table, straighten his jacket with that particular unconscious confidence of a man who has never once in his life doubted that a room would receive him warmly, and walk to the small riser at the front of the ballroom where a microphone waited on a stand draped in white hydrangea. 210 faces turned toward him. I saw, at the edge of my vision, a young man in a catering uniform near the kitchen doors set down a tray with unusual precision, and a woman refilling water glasses at table 6 straightened slightly, her hand drifting, just barely, toward her hip. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my face, I made absolutely certain, showed nothing at all. "When I think about my sister," Marcus began, and his voice carried easily through the room, warm, practiced, the exact voice he had used to explain away every red flag I had ever raised over 3 years. I think about someone who's never once let obstacles stop her from building the life she wanted. I watched Priscilla beam at that line, entirely unaware of the irony sitting 11 feet from her disguised as a waiter. Marcus continued, "Something about family being the one investment that never depreciates. a line so grotesquely, unintentionally literal given what I now knew about his actual investments, that I felt a laugh rise in my throat and had to press my tongue against the back of my teeth to keep it down. And I think about the Whitfield name, he went on, his hand resting on the microphone stand now, and what it's meant for generations to be able to say you're one of us. Loyalty, standing by your people, choosing the people who choose you back. That was the line. That was the exact phrase we had agreed on, the one he had rehearsed in our kitchen 2 nights earlier, the trigger my father and Agent Okonkwo Marsh had settled on, because it would place Marcus, unmistakably, mid-sentence, at the center of the room, invoking the very family loyalty that had enabled every fraud beneath it. I saw the woman at table 6 move first, walking calmly, unhurriedly, toward the riser, and behind her, the young man from the kitchen doors, and behind them both, moving in through the ballroom's main entrance with a speed and formation that instantly silenced the string quartet mid-phrase, 4 more agents in FBI windbreakers, followed by 2 uniformed officers. "Marcus Whitfield," the lead agent said, and her voice, though not raised, carried through a room that had gone utterly, completely silent, 210 people frozen mid-bite, mid-sip, mid-conversation. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and mortgage fraud in connection with an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I watched Marcus's face do something I had genuinely never seen it do in 6 years. Watched the practiced warmth drain out of it entirely, replaced by an expression of pure, animal panic. His eyes scanning the room wildly until they found me, standing near the back in my deliberately unremarkable navy dress, and I watched him understand, in that single locked glance across 210 frozen guests, that this was not a mistake, this was not some agency error that would be sorted out with a phone call. This was the box on my porch, finally, fully opened, 4 months later, in front of every single person whose good opinion he had spent his entire life curating. Eleanor was the first to react audibly, a single sharp cry of, "This is absolutely unacceptable. Do you know who this family is?" directed at the agents, with the exact same reflexive arrogance she had aimed at every inconvenient reality for 6 decades, as though a badge might be persuaded to reconsider federal charges out of respect for a name attached to a portrait in the club hallway. Richard simply stood, his face gray, his mouth opening and closing without sound. A man who had spent his entire adult life assuming resources existed to be used by him now watching. For the first time, resources being taken away by force. Priscilla began to cry, not, I noted, with a coldness that surprised even me, for her brother, but audibly repeating, "My renewal, this is my renewal," as though the timing of the arrest were the true injustice being committed. Agent Okonkwo Marsh, who had entered with the arresting team, stepped toward the microphone Marcus had just been forced away from, and in a calm, clear voice addressed the room directly. Something I later learned was not strictly procedure but a choice she had made, at my father's specific request, because he understood that public fraud sometimes requires public correction, that 210 witnesses walking out of that ballroom with the story only half told would let the Whitfield family spend the next decade quietly reshaping the narrative in their own favor. This investigation, Agent Okonkwo Marsh said, involves the theft of over $800,000 from multiple victims, including elderly individuals who trusted Mr. Whitfield with their retirement savings, and involves a bigamous marriage entered into under false pretenses that invalidated Mr. Whitfield's legal marriage to his current wife, and a mortgage secured through document forgery. She let that settle for exactly 3 seconds before adding, "Any of Mr. Whitfield's family members with information relevant to this investigation are asked to cooperate with agents present tonight." That last sentence was the one that finally cracked the room's silence into chaos, because it was the one that made clear this was not simply Marcus's reckoning. It was an invitation for consequences to spread. I watched Bianca, who had been seated at a table near the back, a guest Eleanor had, astonishingly, still invited despite what I now suspected Eleanor had known all along, rise and attempt to move quickly toward the exit, only to be intercepted, gently but unmistakably, by the second uniformed officer, who asked her, in a voice that carried clearly across the now buzzing room, to please remain, that agents would need to speak with her, given her role as an officer of Sable Point Capital Partners. Bianca's face, opportunistic to the last, cycled visibly through calculation, through the fast mental arithmetic of a woman assessing whether cooperation or denial served her better, before settling into a brittle, furious composure. I did not move from where I stood at the back of the room. I did not need to. My father found me first, resting a hand briefly on my shoulder, and my mother stood on my other side, and the three of us watched, together, as 210 guests who had spent 6 years watching me be introduced as Marcus's wife, the one with the accounting job, a category, a footnote, an entry in the Whitfield ledger of assets, finally watched a different story assert itself in real time. The accountant had found every number, and the numbers had been true the entire time. Eleanor turned at some point in the chaos and found me across the room, and for the first time in 6 years I watched something other than arrogance cross her face, something that might have been recognition, or might simply have been the dawning understanding that the daughter-in-law she had dismissed as beneath the family's station had, in fact, been the instrument of the family's undoing. Though I suspect, even in that moment, Eleanor's mind was already working to construct a version of events in which she remained blameless. She opened her mouth as if to speak to me, and I met her eyes and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say that 4 months of documented, verified, notarized truth had not already said far more effectively than I ever could in a single sentence across a wrecked ballroom. 14 months have passed since that ballroom went silent, and I want to tell you, plainly and specifically, what happened to each of them, because I think the specifics matter more than any general statement about karma or justice, and because for 4 months I lived on nothing but specifics, and I've found I can't stop now. Marcus pleaded guilty 8 months after his arrest to reduced charges of wire fraud and mortgage fraud, in exchange for cooperating fully with prosecutors regarding the Sable Point client losses, a cooperation that, notably, did nothing to reduce the restitution he was ordered to pay. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, currently serving that sentence at a low-security facility in Estill, South Carolina, and ordered to pay $890,000 in restitution, a sum that, given his complete lack of remaining assets once the condo, the Range Rover, and every account traceable to Sable Point had been seized and liquidated, will realistically take him decades to satisfy. Decades he will spend, per the terms of his sentence, garnished at a percentage of whatever income he manages to earn for the rest of his working life. I have received exactly 1 letter from him, 4 months into his sentence, 3 pages long, which I read once, in full, standing at my own kitchen counter, and which contained not a single sentence that took direct responsibility for anything, only variations on the theme that he never meant for it to go this far, and that he hoped someday I might understand the pressure he'd been under. I did not respond. I do not intend to. Eleanor Whitfield lost the house on Trad Street within 5 months, the landlord declining to renew a lease once the arrest made local news. Coverage that ran, with what I can only describe as poetic precision, in the same society pages that had once printed photographs of her at charity galas, describing her family's 300 acres of heritage. She now lives in a 2-bedroom rental in Mount Pleasant with Richard, and works 3 days a week at a high-end consignment boutique on Coleman Boulevard, folding cashmere sweaters that would have, in her previous life, been the exact kind of item she donated for tax purposes and then complained about the appraisal value of. I am told, by a mutual acquaintance who did not know better than to mention it to me, that Eleanor has told coworkers she is between projects, and that the boutique work is temporary, just until the family trust matures. A trust I know for a fact does not exist and never has. Arrogance, it turns out, does not require accurate information to survive. It only requires a willing audience, and Eleanor, remarkably, has managed to find one, even now, even here. Richard Whitfield's country club membership, the one at the very yacht club where his son was arrested, was revoked within a week, not for the arrest itself, technically, but for the $11,000 in dues he still owed that the club's board, sensing the shifting winds, suddenly found itself unwilling to keep forgiving. He filed for personal bankruptcy 9 months ago, listing debts of over $200,000, much of it, I now understand from the filing, money borrowed over the years from friends and extended family who, like me, had simply never expected repayment, and had never asked for it in writing. He is 65 now and works, when he works, doing occasional consulting for a friend's boat brokerage. Consulting that consists largely, from what I understand, of standing near expensive boats and talking to prospective buyers about the Whitfield name, a name that, at least in Charleston, now produces a very different reaction than it once did. Priscilla and Colton divorced 4 months after the arrest, not over any revelation about Marcus, but because the financial scrutiny that followed the FBI investigation exposed, to Priscilla for what she claimed was the first time, that Colton had been quietly draining their own joint accounts for over a year to cover gambling losses, a discovery that struck me, when I heard about it, as almost darkly funny in its symmetry. The family that had enabled one financial predator for years turned out to be harboring a second one they'd simply never bothered to audit. Priscilla lost the house on Wentworth Street, moved back in temporarily with Eleanor and Richard in their two-bedroom rental. A living arrangement I am told is not going smoothly, and has, as of 3 months ago, rebranded her social media account around healing and rebuilding. A pivot that, true to form, generated a brief spike in followers and no visible increase in actual income. Her monthly stipend, of course, no longer exists. There is no longer anyone left in a position to pay it. Bianca Reyes was charged as an accessory to wire fraud, given her documented role in structuring the Sable Point Growth Trust to conceal assets from discovery, and reached a plea agreement requiring 18 months of probation, a permanent bar from working in any capacity within the financial services industry, and full forfeiture of the Sullivan's Island condo, which was sold at auction to help satisfy the restitution owed to the elderly Sable Point victims. She left South Carolina entirely within weeks of her sentencing hearing. The last information anyone in this story has about her, secondhand, is that she is working in hospitality management somewhere in Florida. A career pivot that suggests opportunism, at least remains intact even when every other advantage has been stripped away. Danielle Farrow, Marcus's actual undivorced wife of 9 years before he ever met me, has become, unexpectedly, someone I speak with fairly regularly, two women connected by the same man's deception across 2 decades and 2 states, comparing notes that turned out to overlap in ways neither of us could have predicted, and finding, in that comparison, a strange and genuine friendship neither of us expected to need. Her Nevada complaint and mine, combined, gave prosecutors far more leverage than either would have provided alone, and she has told me more than once that finding out I existed, finding out there had been another woman living inside the same unresolved lie, was in some ways the final piece of evidence that let her stop blaming herself for not seeing it sooner. I understand that feeling completely. As for me, I left Merrow & Klein 11 months ago and opened my own practice, Ashworth Forensic Advisory, specializing specifically in matrimonial and elder financial fraud investigation. Work that grew directly, uncomfortably, and then meaningfully out of the 4 months I spent auditing my own marriage. I have 11 active clients now, 3 of them referred by Agent Okonkwo Marsh's office directly, and a waiting list that tells me, more than I wish it did, how many other people are currently sitting where I once sat, reading bank statements at midnight, trying to convince themselves that what they're seeing has an innocent explanation. My parents still live in the same house I grew up in, and my father, who is 71 now, still tells me, whenever I call him frustrated about a difficult case, the same 4 words he told me on my porch 14 months ago, and I have come to understand them now, not as an instruction to stay silent, but as the single most valuable inheritance he ever gave me. Don't make a scene, gather the proof, and let the proof make the scene for you, at a time and place of your choosing, in front of every single person who needs to see it. I sold the house Marcus and I lived in, the one built, I now know, partly on forged mortgage paperwork, and I bought a smaller place near the Battery, on my own, under my own name, with a mortgage I qualified for entirely on my own income. And some mornings I stand in that kitchen with a cup of coffee, and I think about the version of myself who spent 3 years auditing strangers' fraud for a living, while missing the fraud in her own bed. And I ask myself the only question that still matters, the one I'll leave you with tonight. How many numbers are you not checking? In the one ledger you've never thought to open, simply because the person on the other side of it once told you, convincingly, that you didn't need to. There's a detail I left out, one I think about more than almost anything else from that whole ordeal, and I want to go back and give it to you now, because it happened 3 days after the arrest, long before any of the sentences I just described had been handed down, back when everything still felt raw and unresolved, and I genuinely did not know how any of it would end. I drove, alone, to the federal courthouse on Meeting Street for Marcus's initial arraignment, the first time I would see him since that ballroom, now in a beige jumpsuit instead of a tailored suit, wrists cuffed in front of him, standing beside a court-appointed attorney because every asset that might have paid for private counsel had already been frozen by that point. He looked smaller than I remembered, which surprised me, because I had spent 4 months imagining this exact moment as some kind of towering confrontation, and instead I sat in the 3rd row of a public gallery, watching a magistrate judge read charges in a flat, procedural voice, and Marcus never once turned around to look for me, not once. And I realized, sitting there, that the not looking told me more than any apology ever could have. He wasn't sparing me the confrontation out of guilt. He simply understood, finally, that there was nothing left to say that would change the outcome, and Marcus, I had learned over 6 years, only ever engaged with situations he believed he could still influence. I want to tell you about my brother too, Nathaniel, 31, a pediatric resident at Musk, who I had, deliberately, kept almost entirely in the dark during the 4 months of investigation. Not because I didn't trust him, but because Nathaniel has never once in his life been able to keep an expression off his face, a trait that made him a wonderful, transparent little brother growing up, and would have made him a catastrophic liability at a single Whitfield family dinner. I told him everything the night after the arrest, sitting on my back porch with 2 glasses of bourbon neither of us finished, and I watched him cry. Actually cry, for me. In a way I hadn't let myself do yet, and at some point he said, "Cam, how did you sit across from these people for 4 months and just eat dinner with them?" And I told him the truth, which is that I didn't sit across from them, not really. I sat across from a case file wearing their faces. It was the only way I found to survive it, treating every dinner, every fitting, every phone call as data collection rather than relationship. And I am still, 14 months later, trying to figure out how to feel things about people in real time again, instead of filing them away for later analysis. The restitution hearing, 5 months after Marcus's guilty plea, brought together in one federal courtroom every person this scheme had touched. And I want to describe it because it was, in its quiet, procedural way, more emotionally devastating than the ballroom arrest had been. Precisely because there was no drama to it at all. Just an assistant United States attorney reading names and dollar figures into the record in the same flat tone the magistrate had used at arraignment. Marguerite Colby, the widow who had told my mother that Whitfields don't need to steal, was there in person, 83 years old, walking with a cane, and when the prosecutor read her loss, $141,000, nearly a third of her total retirement savings, she made a small sound, not quite a sob, more like the air going out of something, and her daughter, sitting beside her, gripped her hand so hard I could see the knuckles whiten from 4 rows back. I had never met Marguerite before that day. I introduced myself afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, and told her I was sorry, genuinely, uselessly sorry, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're the one who found it, aren't you?" Not a question, really. And when I nodded, she took both my hands in hers, papery and cold and surprisingly strong, and said, "Then don't you dare apologize to me, young lady. You're the reason I get anything back at all." I have thought about that exchange more times than I can count in the months since. The local press coverage, once it started, took on a life of its own that I hadn't fully anticipated, because Charleston is, beneath its magnolia-lined manners, a genuinely small town where everyone of a certain social stratum knows everyone else. And the Whitfield name had circulated at enough charity boards and country club dinners over 3 generations that the story became, for about 6 weeks, the single most discussed piece of gossip south of Broad Street. A reporter from the Post and Courier called me 4 times before I agreed to a single brief statement, delivered on my own front steps, the same steps where the box had first appeared. A detail the reporter noted in her article with what I assume she thought was poignant symmetry and what I experienced, privately, as almost unbearable. I said only that I had cooperated fully with federal investigators, that my thoughts were with the other victims of the fraud, and that I would not be commenting further. And then I went inside and did not read a single comment section for 3 months, because I had learned, over 4 months of investigation, exactly how much damage could be done by people who thought they understood a situation from the outside. And I did not have room left, that particular autumn, to absorb the opinions of strangers on top of everything else. I want to be honest about something else too, something that doesn't fit neatly into a story about vindication and justice, which is that even now, 14 months later, I still sometimes reach for my phone to tell Marcus something small and mundane, a funny thing a client said, a good parking spot I found downtown, the specific muscle memory of 6 years of marriage that doesn't simply vanish because the marriage turns out to have been legally void the entire time. I have a good therapist now, Dr. Elaine Prescott, who specializes in what she calls institutional betrayal, the particular damage that occurs when the betrayal comes not from one bad actor, but from an entire system of people, a family, who all quietly, collectively decided your comfort mattered less than their own convenience. She told me in one of our early sessions that the reason this hurt in a way that felt qualitatively different from an ordinary divorce wasn't just the fraud or the affair or the bigamy individually, but the cumulative discovery that an entire ecosystem of people had looked at me for years and decided, unanimously, silently, that I was a resource rather than a person worth protecting. That reframing helped me more than almost anything else in this process, because it let me stop asking what's wrong with me that I didn't see it, and start asking the more useful question, the one I now ask every single client who walks into my office describing a spouse or a business partner who somehow always has an answer ready before the question is even fully asked. What does it cost this person for you to keep believing them? And who benefits when you do? I think it's worth going back further, all the way to the beginning, because there's a version of this story where I tell you Marcus was a monster from the very first date, and that would be a lie, and I promised myself, sitting down to put all of this into words, that I would tell it exactly as it happened, not as it's more satisfying to remember. Our first real date, 2 weeks after the charity auction, was at a small Italian place on Broad Street, and Marcus arrived 11 minutes late, apologizing with a story about a client call running long, a story I had no reason to doubt, and every reason, looking back, to have logged as the very first entry in a pattern I wouldn't recognize for years. He asked me thoughtful questions that night, real ones, about why I'd chosen forensic accounting specifically, about a case involving a nonprofit director who'd embezzled scholarship funds meant for foster kids that had made me so angry I'd cried in my car afterward, and Marcus had listened, actually listened, in a way that made me feel, for the first time and longer than I wanted to admit, genuinely seen. I have wondered endlessly in the months since whether that listening was real, or whether it was, even then, reconnaissance, Marcus learning exactly what kind of woman I was, so he could calibrate exactly how much scrutiny he'd eventually need to deflect. I still don't have a clean answer. I suspect the truth is uncomfortable and unglamorous. It was probably both. A man capable of genuine warmth in the moment, and simultaneously incapable of letting that warmth outweigh his own convenience. The instant convenience required a lie. The proposal came 11 months later, on the seawall along the Battery at sunset, Marcus down on one knee with a ring I now know, from records my father eventually pulled, had been purchased on a payment plan through a jeweler on King Street. $3,000 financed over 18 months at a jewelry store's punishing interest rate, a detail Marcus never mentioned, letting me believe, because I never asked and he never offered, that the ring had simply been paid for outright the way anyone with the means the Whitfield name implied would have paid for it. I said yes. Of course I said yes. The sky over the harbor was doing that specific deep orange to violet thing it only does for about 6 minutes in autumn, and there was a street musician playing something slow on a saxophone half a block away, and Marcus's hands were shaking, actually shaking when he opened the box. And I remember thinking, in that moment, that the shaking meant something, that nervousness was proof of sincerity. I understand now that nervousness proves nothing except that a person cares about the outcome of a moment, and a con man wants his mark to say yes every bit as urgently, if not more so, than an honest man does. Our wedding day itself, the one at St. Philip's that I mentioned earlier, deserves more than the passing reference I gave it, because I want you to have the full picture of what I believed I was building, so that the fraud, when it comes, lands with its full weight. I wore my grandmother's veil, hand-tatted lace from 1961, carefully preserved by my mother for 34 years specifically for this. The church smelled like beeswax candles, and the particular cool stone smell old churches hold on to, even in a Charleston summer. My father walked me down the aisle, and I felt his arm trembling slightly under my hand, the only time in my entire life I've ever felt my father's composure crack even a fraction. And at the altar, Marcus looked at me with an expression I would have sworn, would still swear under oath if asked, was genuine, unguarded joy. Mine included a line about how I'd spent my whole career learning to trust numbers, because people could lie but numbers couldn't, and how meeting him had taught me that some people were worth trusting the same unconditional way. A line the entire church laughed warmly at. A line that I have not been able to read back in my own wedding program, which I still, inexplicably, have not thrown away, without feeling something close to physical pain. I share all of this because I want to be precise about something the internet often gets wrong about stories like mine. The discovery of fraud doesn't retroactively make the earlier years feel fake in the moment they happened. It recontextualizes them. The saxophone on the seawall was real. My father's trembling arm was real. The specific, overwhelming relief of feeling chosen by someone after years of dating in Charleston's exhausting, status-obsessed social circuit, that was real too. What wasn't real was the foundation underneath all of it. The assumption that the person building this life alongside me was building it in good faith, with the same rules I was using. And that asymmetry, the fact that I was playing an honest game against someone running an entirely different set of rules the whole time, is the part that took Dr. Prescott and me the longest to work through in therapy. I want to take you inside that 4-hour interview with the FBI, the one I mentioned briefly, because I think the mechanics of it matter, and because I've had enough clients ask me since what it actually feels like to sit across from federal agents and hand over your own marriage as evidence. The conference room was on the 4th floor of the federal building. No windows, a table bolted to the floor, a box of tissues that Agent Okonkwo Marsh slid toward me before I'd even said a word, which told me she'd done this before, many times, and knew exactly what was coming even if I didn't yet. She was flanked by a younger agent named Trevor Sims, who took notes on a laptop and rarely spoke, and she started, deliberately, not with the money but with the marriage itself, asking me to describe, in my own words, the day-to-day texture of my relationship with Marcus, a question I initially found strange until I understood, partway through answering it, that she was building a behavioral profile, looking for the specific rhythm of manipulation that fraud investigators learn to recognize across dozens of similar cases. The small verbal tics, the way I unconsciously softened language around Marcus's excuses, the way I used phrases like, "he probably just," and "I'm sure it's," throughout my own account of events that, laid end to end, painted an unmistakable pattern of a woman who had trained herself, over years, to pre-forgive. Then we moved to the money, and this was the part where my professional training took over, because I could answer these questions the way I'd answer them about any other case, walking Agent Okonkwo Marsh and Trevor Sims through the 11 transfers, the timing pattern tied to my bonus deposits, the fabricated fund statements, laying photocopies across the bolted table in the exact chronological order I'd organized them in my own dining room. And somewhere in the middle of that portion of the interview, Agent Okonkwo Marsh looked up from the documents and said, quietly, "You built this file better than some of our own agents would have." And I remember that comment landing strangely, a compliment and an accusation at once. Proof of my competence and proof, simultaneously, of exactly how long and how thoroughly I'd had to become fluent in my own husband's deception before anyone official believed me enough to act. The most useful piece of information that came out of that interview, information I hadn't had before walking in, was that Sable Point Capital Partners had, briefly, employed an office manager named Renata Osei 11 months before the arrest, who had quit after just 7 weeks, and who had, it turned out, already filed her own complaint with the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs regarding what she described as irregularities in client fund statements, a complaint that had languished, understaffed, and underprioritized in a queue for nearly a year before my father's case, backed by a retired federal judge's credibility, finally gave it the momentum to move. I contacted Renata myself after the arrest over coffee at a shop on Cannon Street, and she told me she'd noticed, within her first month, that the fund performance numbers Marcus generated never varied by more than a fraction of a percentage point from a formula she eventually reverse-engineered as simply the S&P 500's actual return plus a flat 4.5%, applied uniformly across every single client statement regardless of what Marcus claimed the underlying investments were. A level of manufactured consistency so lazy, in retrospect, that Renata said she genuinely could not believe no client had ever caught it. "People don't audit people they admire," she told me, stirring her coffee. And I told her that was, more or less, the exact sentence I now open every consultation with at my own firm. There's one more thread from that period I haven't given you yet, the Colton subplot, because at the time it seemed like a minor domestic footnote, and it turned out to matter enormously to how the whole Whitfield family's finances actually worked. During the seating chart meeting at Eleanor's house, the one where she insisted her oldest friends be seated closer to the head table than my own parents, Colton pulled me aside afterward, in the driveway, visibly agitated in a way I hadn't seen from him before, and asked, almost desperately, whether I thought Marcus might be willing to help him out, with what he called a short-term thing, an ask I now recognize, with everything I later learned, as Colton already drowning in gambling debt 8 months before that conversation, already circling the same family well that Richard and Priscilla had been drawing from for years, a well that, unbeknownst to any of them, had already run completely dry, its remaining water entirely stolen from 6 trusting strangers and 1 unsuspecting wife. I told Colton, honestly, that things were tight, which was the first entirely true sentence I think I ever said to anyone in that family during the entire 4 months of investigation. And he looked at me with an expression of genuine confusion, as though tightness were a concept that had simply never been explained to him before, the same wounded incomprehension I'd seen on Richard's face over the marina loan, a family expression I realized standing in that driveway, passed down like a piece of silverware, inherited by marriage as easily as by blood. Deborah Okafor deserves more space in this story than I've given her so far, because without her methodical, almost unnervingly patient surveillance work, the personal betrayal, Loop B, as I've come to think of it in the shorthand I use with Dr. Prescott, would have remained an assumption rather than a documented fact. And documented fact was the only currency that mattered once we were building a case that had to survive a defense attorney's cross-examination. Deborah had spent 19 years as a private investigator specializing exclusively in financial infidelity, a niche, she explained to my mother, in their first meeting, exists because family courts and criminal courts alike require a level of evidentiary rigor that a hurt spouse's suspicion, however accurate, simply cannot provide on its own. She worked in 11-day cycles, she told me later, when I finally met her myself. 3 separate surveillance windows spaced across 14 months, specifically so that Marcus's pattern of visits to the Sullivan's Island condo couldn't be dismissed by any future defense argument as a single isolated coincidence. She photographed license plates, cross-referenced parking timestamps against Marcus's own calendar, which, astonishingly, he had shared with me through a joint scheduling app for years, believing, I suppose, that anything with Sable Point client meeting written across it in his own handwriting would never be questioned. Deborah found 17 separate visits over 14 months, ranging from 40 minutes to, on one occasion, an entire overnight stay logged during a weekend Marcus had told me he was in Atlanta for an investor conference that, when Deborah cross-checked the hotel and conference center records, had never actually taken place at all that particular weekend. The seating chart meeting at Eleanor's house, the one I mentioned only briefly, ran nearly 3 hours, and I want to give you the fuller texture of it because it's the clearest single window I have into how completely, casually, this family had learned to treat me as furniture that occasionally wrote checks. Eleanor had laid out a physical diagram of the ballroom on her dining table, little paper circles representing each round table, and she moved my parents' paper circle from table 2 to table 6 with the same brisk, unbothered efficiency she might use to move a salt shaker, explaining, without looking up, that the Hendersons had known the family since the Reagan administration and simply had to be near the front. When I pointed out, as gently as I could manage, given everything I already knew by that point, that my parents were, after all, the brides, meaning Marcus's in-laws of 6 years, Eleanor smiled that particular smile, the one that never once, in 6 years, reached her eyes, and said, "Of course, darling, and we adore your parents, but there's a difference between family and family. If you understand what I mean," a sentence so breathtakingly, casually cruel that I actually wrote it down verbatim in my notebook that same evening, less as evidence for the FBI, and more, I think now, as evidence for myself, a reminder, on the difficult nights, of exactly what I was owed and exactly who had never intended to pay it. The dress fitting for Priscilla's renewal happened 8 days before the event, at a bridal boutique on King Street, and I remember standing there holding a pincushion, watching Priscilla examine herself in a 3-way mirror in a gown that cost more than what I had, by that point, calculated as Priscilla's entire annual brand income, and listening to her ask the seamstress, apropos of nothing, whether the boutique might consider gifting the alterations in exchange for exposure. A request the seamstress, a woman probably in her 50s who had clearly encountered this exact request before, declined with the practiced patience of someone who has spent a career fielding it. Priscilla turned to me afterward in the parking lot and said, entirely seriously, "It's honestly kind of insulting that she said no, don't you think? I have 11,000 followers, and I remember looking at her, genuinely searching her face for irony, and finding none at all, and understanding, in that moment, with total clarity, that Priscilla did not experience her own laziness as laziness. She experienced it as an underappreciated form of labor, a genuine, sincere belief that describing effort constituted a category of effort in itself. And I think that sincerity, more than anything else about her, is what made her the hardest of the 4 secondary antagonists for me to ultimately feel any satisfaction about. Because there was no cunning in Priscilla to defeat, only a kind of learned, generational helplessness dressed up in expensive athleisure. I met Danielle Farrow in person for the first time 7 months after the arrest, at a coffee shop near the Reno airport during a layover I deliberately extended by 4 hours specifically to make the meeting possible. She was shorter than I'd pictured, with the kind of steady, watchful eyes that told me immediately she had spent the better part of a decade learning to read rooms for danger, before anyone else caught up to what was happening. We talked for 3 hours, She told me about the 8 chaotic months of her own relationship with Marcus in his early 20s, a relationship that had, in her account, followed a startlingly similar shape to mine. A whirlwind courtship, grand romantic gestures financed by money that turned out not to exist. A slow accumulation of financial irregularities she'd talked herself out of questioning, and finally an abrupt disappearance. Marcus simply stopped returning her calls one week, told her later, when she finally reached him, that he'd handled the paperwork for their divorce and that she shouldn't worry about it. She believed him for 9 years. I think that's the thing nobody wants to say out loud, Danielle told me, wrapping both hands around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. We weren't stupid. We were consistent. We just kept trusting a man who was consistently unworthy of it, and there's no accounting class that teaches you how to spot that in time, because the whole trick only works on people capable of genuine trust in the first place. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me during the entire ordeal. The legal process of formally voiding my marriage took nearly 5 months to complete, running on a separate track from the criminal case, handled by a family law attorney named Wanda Ellery, whom my father selected specifically because she had, over a 30-year career, handled exactly 4 prior cases involving undissolved prior marriages, a specialty so narrow that Wanda joked, in our first meeting, that she'd never expected to use that particular expertise more than once in her career, and here I was, her 5th client in that exact situation. Because the marriage was void from its inception rather than simply dissolved, the legal framing shifted entirely. I was not divorcing Marcus. Technically, I had never been married to him at all, which meant the 6 years we had spent together were reclassified, in the eyes of South Carolina family court, as an extended unmarried cohabitation, a phrase that appeared, cold and clinical, on page 3 of the final court order, a phrase I read 4 times, sitting in Wanda's office, before I fully absorbed what it meant, that legally, formally, on paper, I had never been anyone's wife at all, that the word I had used to describe myself at dinner parties and doctors' offices and on tax forms for 3 straight years had simply never been true. That reclassification, painful as it was to read, turned out to work enormously in my favor financially, exactly as my father had predicted the first night we mapped out the case strategy at his kitchen table. Because there had never been a valid marriage, there was no marital estate to divide equally under South Carolina's equitable distribution laws. Instead, I was treated as an individual whose separate property, my income, my retirement accounts, my portion of jointly titled assets, had been fraudulently commingled and, in significant part, stolen by a man with no legal claim to any of it in the first place. Wanda secured a civil judgment against Marcus for the full remaining value of what the criminal restitution order didn't already cover, a judgment that will follow him, accruing interest, for the rest of his life attached to any future income, any future inheritance, any future asset he ever manages to acquire again. He built an entire architecture designed to make you legally powerless if he was ever caught, Wanda told me, near the end of that process, and the architecture collapsed backward onto him instead, because bigamy doesn't just void a marriage, it voids the protections a real marriage would have given him too. Going back to the ballroom for a moment, because I realize I moved through the immediate aftermath too quickly, and there are details I want to give you. Details that only became clear to me weeks later when Agent Okonkwo Marsh's office shared portions of the videographer's footage as evidence. Footage that, in one of the darker ironies of this entire story, Eleanor had personally paid for, specifically to create what she called the family archive. That footage captured, in wide, unflinching, high definition, every single reaction in that room during the arrest. And watching it later, alone, in Wanda's office during an evidentiary review, I saw things I hadn't caught in the moment. A table of Eleanor's oldest friends, the very Hendersons whose paper circle had been moved ahead of my own parents, exchanging a rapid, wide-eyed glance the instant the agent's windbreakers became visible. The specific, practiced social calculation of people recalculating, in real time, exactly how much distance they now needed to put between themselves and the Whitfield name. I saw the club's general manager standing near the kitchen doors, quietly pulling out his phone, and I would later learn he had used that moment to draft the letter, sent the following Monday, formally and permanently terminating the Whitfield family's membership, portrait donation notwithstanding. And I saw myself, in the wide shot, standing perfectly still at the back of the room in navy, hands folded, while 209 other people moved, gasped, reached for phones, And I remember watching that footage of myself and thinking that the stillness Wanda and Dr. Prescott would later both separately describe to me as evidence of trauma was, in that specific 11-second window, actually the single most powerful thing I have ever done in my life. Because everyone in that room could see, without a word from me, exactly who had been telling the truth the entire time. I want to tell you about the day I opened Ashworth Forensic Advisory, because it felt, more than the arrest, more than the restitution hearing, more than anything else in this entire story, like the actual ending, the one that belonged to me instead of to Marcus's downfall. I signed the lease on a small second-floor office on Broad Street, 4 rooms above a stationery shop, on a Tuesday morning in March, 11 months after the box first arrived on my porch. And I remember standing in the empty front room, sunlight coming through the tall old windows in long yellow columns across bare hardwood, and thinking about how strange it was that this quiet, unremarkable moment, holding a set of keys, felt bigger than the ballroom ever had. My mother came by that first afternoon with a housewarming gift, a framed photograph of my grandmother, the one whose lace veil I'd worn at the wedding that turned out to be no wedding at all, and my mother said, hanging it herself on the wall behind what would become my desk, she'd have liked this. She never trusted a man who didn't ask enough questions about the family finances before the wedding. A comment that made us both laugh, hard, the specific relieved laughter of people who have been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally set it down. My first official client walked in 9 days later, a woman named Solange Marchetti, 68, whose late husband's business partner had, she suspected, been quietly siphoning profits from their shared company for years before her husband's death. Using exactly the kind of structured below-threshold transfers I recognized instantly from my own case. Transfers of $31,000 and $34,000 and $36,000, always just under the reporting threshold, always timed to land within days of the company's quarterly distributions. I sat across from Solange in my new office, still smelling faintly of fresh paint, and I listened to her describe the specific, sick feeling of looking at numbers that don't add up, and desperately wanting there to be an innocent explanation. And I told her, honestly, that I understood that feeling in a way most forensic accountants in this state could not claim to, and something in her posture eased, visibly, at hearing that, the particular relief of being believed by someone who had also once needed to be believed. I found the fraud within 6 weeks. Solange recovered $211,000. It is, to this day, the single most satisfying case I have closed since opening my own practice. Not because of the dollar figure, but because of the specific look on Solange's face when I called to tell her. The look of a woman finally being handed proof that her own instincts, the ones everyone around her had spent months quietly encouraging her to doubt, had been correct the entire time. I think often about the honeymoon Marcus and I took. 10 days in the Amalfi Coast, an extravagance I now know, from the credit records my father eventually pulled, was financed almost entirely on a card that carried a balance for the following 14 months. A balance I helped pay down without ever knowing what portion of it was mine to owe, and what portion was simply Marcus's debt quietly transferred onto shared paper. I remember a specific evening on that trip, sitting on a terrace above Positano's harbor, the water below doing that impossible layered blue to turquoise thing at sunset, a bottle of local white wine between us, and Marcus telling me, with what I would have sworn at the time was total, unguarded sincerity, that he'd never felt as safe with anyone as he felt with me, that being with me made him want to be a better, steadier version of himself. I believed him completely. I have gone back and forth, in therapy, on whether that sentence was ever true in any sense at all, whether there was a version of Marcus, in that specific golden hour on that specific terrace, who genuinely meant it, or whether the entire performance was calibrated, consciously or not, to secure exactly the kind of unconditional trust that would let him operate, for years afterward, without ever facing the audit he'd clearly always known, somewhere underneath the performance, that he deserved. 1 year to the day after the arrest, I drove back to the yacht club, not for any event, just to sit in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes, an errand I hadn't planned and couldn't fully explain to myself even as I was doing it. The portrait of Richard's late father had been quietly removed from the main hallway. I could see the faint rectangular outline where it used to hang through the front windows, a slightly less faded patch of wall, where 6 decades of a family's carefully managed reputation had briefly been mounted and then, finally, taken down. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, watching ordinary members come and go, none of them aware of what had happened in that ballroom a year earlier. Most of them, I suspect, having already forgotten or never having known at all. because that is the other quiet lesson of this whole ordeal. Institutions absorb scandal and move on far faster than the individual people at the center of it ever get to. Then I drove home to my own house near the Battery, bought under my own name with my own money, and I made dinner for one, and it did not feel sad the way it might have felt 18 months earlier. It felt, for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, entirely uncomplicatedly mine. I haven't told you much about my father's career on the bench, beyond the broad strokes, and I think it matters here, because the specific texture of it shaped exactly how he approached building the case against Marcus. He was appointed to the federal bench at 41, the youngest judge in the district's history at the time, after a career as a prosecutor that included, most famously, a 14-defendant racketeering case against a shrimping company that had been laundering money through falsified catchweights for nearly a decade. A case that took my father and his team almost 3 years to build because, he always told me, growing up, the hardest part was never finding the crime. It was proving it in a way 12 strangers with no financial background could follow, without a single gap for a defense attorney to slip through. That case, I now understand, was practically a training manual for what he did with Marcus's fraud. Patient, layered, over-corroborated, built specifically to survive the exact kind of scrutiny a skilled defense attorney would throw at it. My mother's career ran parallel and complementary to his, in a way I never fully appreciated until I needed both of them at once. As an assistant United States attorney, she had specialized, for the final 8 years of her practice, in elder financial exploitation cases. Work she took on, she told me once, after her own grandmother had lost nearly $60,000 to a fraudulent home repair scheme in the 90s. A loss the family never fully recovered from, and that shaped, permanently, what my mother considered the most important work a prosecutor could do. When she interviewed Marguerite Colby and the other elderly Sable Point victims, she wasn't performing a skill she'd learned for my sake. She was doing, one more time, the exact work she'd spent 8 years of her professional life devoted to. Work she'd simply never expected to need to do for her own daughter's sake. There was a second elderly victim I haven't told you about yet. A man named Everett Pruitt, 79, a retired shrimp boat captain who had known Richard Whitfield socially for decades through the very marina community the family's fortune had originally come from, before it sank, literally, with the pilings after that hurricane. Everett had invested $78,000 into the Sable Point Growth Fund specifically because Richard had personally vouched for Marcus at a dock gathering, telling Everett, in front of several witnesses who later gave statements to the FBI, that, "My boy's sharper than any Wall Street type, and family looks after family." Everett lost nearly all of it, and what struck me most, when my mother first told me about his statement to investigators, was that Everett's anger wasn't primarily directed at Marcus. It was directed at Richard, at the specific betrayal of a lifetime's worth of community trust weaponized to open a door Marcus could never have opened on his own. "I've known that family 50 years, Everett told my mother, according to her notes, and I never once thought to ask a Whitfield to prove anything. That was the whole problem. Nobody ever thought to ask a Whitfield to prove anything, going back generations, and eventually somebody in that family was bound to notice nobody was checking." Dr. Prescott and I spent a significant portion of our sessions, especially in the first 6 months, on a specific question that I think matters more than almost anything else in this story, which is the question of whether I would ever trust anyone again, romantically, in the way I had trusted Marcus. I want to give you an honest answer rather than a tidy one. I have not dated seriously since the arrest. I've had 2 dinners with a colleague my mother introduced me to, a tax attorney named James Okafor, no relation to Deborah. Both dinners pleasant, both ending with a handshake instead of anything more. Not because James did anything wrong, but because I am, 14 months out, still recalibrating an internal instrument that I now understand was badly miscalibrated for years. An instrument that mistook fluency for honesty, that mistook a ready answer for a true one. Dr. Prescott told me in one of our more useful sessions that the goal isn't to rebuild the exact same instrument I had before, trusting, immediate to a fault. The goal is to build a better one that can hold both trust and verification at the same time, without treating the second as a betrayal of the first. And I think, some days, I'm getting closer to that. Other days, I catch myself running a mental audit on a perfectly nice man at a perfectly nice dinner, looking for the tell, the 72-hour pattern, the answer that comes half a second too fast, and I have to remind myself, consciously, that not every ready answer is a lie, the same way I once had to remind myself, mistakenly, that every ready answer from Marcus was probably true. My brother Nathaniel finished his residency 6 months ago and has become, unexpectedly, one of the people I talk to most about all of this. More than my parents in some ways, because Nathaniel wasn't inside the strategy of the case the way my parents were. He was simply beside me for the emotional wreckage of it, the version of the story that doesn't fit neatly into a case file. He drove me to the restitution hearing. He sat with me the night the local paper ran its first piece. He is, at 31, the only person in my life who never once, in 14 months, asked me a single question about whether I'd seen it coming or had a feeling, questions well-meaning acquaintances asked constantly in the early months. Questions that always carried, underneath the concern, a faint implication that better vigilance on my part might have prevented all of it. An implication I've come to understand, through months of therapy and months of running my own firm and meeting client after client in exactly my former position, is simply not how sophisticated patient fraud works. It works specifically on people capable of trust, and punishing yourself for having been capable of trust is, in the end, just one more thing the fraud takes from you if you let it. I asked my father once, months after everything had settled, why he chose to deliver that box the way he did, wrapped, silent, on my own porch at 7:14 in the morning, rather than simply sitting me down and telling me directly, the way most parents might choose to break news like this to their child. He thought about it for a long moment before answering, the way he thought about everything, weighing the question the way he'd once weighed evidence from the bench. Because if I'd told you, he said finally, you would have processed it as my conclusion, filtered through my judgment, and some part of you, being you, would have wanted to independently verify it before you fully believed it, which would have taken time we didn't have, and would have meant living with half-knowledge even longer than necessary. But if I put the raw material in your hands and let you do what you do better than almost anyone I've ever watched work a case, I knew you'd reach the conclusion yourself, on your own timeline, with your own certainty, and once you reached it yourself, nothing anyone in that family said afterward was ever going to be able to talk you out of it. It was, I realized, the single most important gift he'd given me in the entire ordeal. Not the evidence itself, but the deliberate choice to let me be the one who assembled it. Because he understood, correctly, that a truth I proved myself would be a truth I could never be gaslit out of. And in the 4 months that followed, sitting across dinner tables from people who smiled and lied and smiled again, that unshakable, self-verified certainty was the only thing that kept me steady. I want to give you the exact moment I found the Nevada marriage certificate, not the summary I gave earlier, but the actual texture of it, because it is, of every discovery in this entire ordeal, the one that changed something permanent in how I understand my own life's timeline. My father called me on a Thursday evening, and I could hear, even before he said anything substantive, a particular carefulness in his voice, the tone he used, I would learn, specifically for the worst news, a tone calibrated to slow a listener down rather than let panic arrive first. He read me the certificate number, the date, the county, the names, slowly, clearly, the way he must have once read verdicts from the bench, and I remember standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where, months later, Marcus would say, "Please don't tell me they actually did it," holding the phone against my ear with a hand that had gone completely numb, staring at the calendar magnet on my refrigerator, a free one from a local dentist's office, and doing math in my head almost involuntarily, counting backward 9 years from my own wedding date, landing on a spring I remembered clearly, a spring when I was 25, finishing my CPA licensure, entirely unaware that on a strip in Las Vegas, a man I hadn't met yet was making a promise to someone else that he would, eventually, also fail to keep. I did not cry that night either, not really. I remember instead feeling a strange, vertiginous kind of clarity, the sensation of an entire structure I'd built my adult identity around, wife, partner, half of a we, simply ceasing to have ever existed. Retroactively, all at once, like watching a building you live in get demolished and discovering, only after the dust clears, that it had actually been condemned the whole time you were living in it. Bianca's plea hearing, which I attended, sitting 3 rows behind her, was shorter and colder than I expected, 22 minutes total, most of it procedural, but I want to give you the one moment that stayed with me, which came when the judge asked Bianca, as a formality, whether she understood the terms of her plea agreement, and Bianca answered, "Yes, Your Honor," in a voice that carried none of the easy warmth I remembered from that Sable Point holiday party, none of the practiced curiosity from the client appreciation event, where she'd asked me pointed questions about my own methodology. Stripped of the performance, Bianca's voice was simply flat, tired, the voice of a 26-year-old woman who had gambled that proximity to Marcus's stolen confidence would outpace the risk of getting caught, and lost. I felt, watching her, less anger than I expected and more of a strange, unwanted pity, because I recognized, in her calculated, opportunistic climb, an ambition that wasn't inherently wrong, only aimed, disastrously, at exactly the wrong target, propping herself up on a foundation she either knew or should have known was stolen from 6 people who trusted a family name that had stopped meaning anything true a very long time ago. I visited Marcus exactly once, 4 months into his sentence, at the facility in Estill, a decision I made not for him but for myself, because Dr. Prescott and I had discussed at length whether I needed to see him in that specific, powerless setting, jumpsuit, visitation room, guard at the door. In order to fully close the loop, my own mind kept reopening at 3 in the morning. He looked older. He asked almost immediately whether I'd found someone, a question so breathtakingly self-centered given the setting that I almost laughed. And then he asked, more quietly, whether I thought he could have been a different person if things had gone differently, a question I recognized instantly as the same kind of pre-built excuse architecture he'd used for 6 years, an attempt to relocate responsibility onto circumstance rather than choice. I told him, calmly, the same clinical calm I'd used across every dinner table for 4 months, that I hadn't come to absolve him or condemn him, only to see, with my own eyes, that the version of him capable of frightening 210 people into silence with a single sentence at a microphone no longer had any power over any room I would ever be standing in again. I left after 11 minutes. I have not gone back and I do not intend to. Running my own firm now, meeting client after client who arrive in my office with the exact same sick, half-formed suspicion I once carried around for months before I let myself name it, I've started noticing patterns that repeat across almost every case. Patterns I wish someone had handed me, plainly, years before that box ever arrived on my porch. The first pattern is what I've started calling the vocabulary borrow, the specific tactic Marcus used against me for years, where a deceptive partner learns your professional or personal language and feeds it back to you slightly altered, so that your own expertise becomes the very thing disarming your suspicion, because the explanation sounds like something you yourself might have said. The second pattern is the threshold instinct, the way skilled financial deception almost always structures itself in amounts just below whatever number triggers additional scrutiny, whether that's a bank's reporting threshold or simply the size of expense that would prompt a partner to ask a follow-up question rather than accept the first answer. The third, and I think the most important, is what Dr. Prescott and I have come to call the borrowed reputation effect, the mechanism by which an entire family or social network's inherited credibility gets extended, automatically, to individuals within it who have done nothing personally to earn it. The exact mechanism that let Marcus walk into rooms full of trusting people simply by virtue of being a Whitfield. The same mechanism that let Richard vouch for his son to Everett Pruitt on a dock. The same mechanism that, I now understand, let me extend 3 years of unquestioned trust to a man largely because everyone around him, his own family included, had spent decades performing a trustworthiness none of them, it turned out, actually possessed. I tell every new client the same thing in our first meeting now, something Marguerite Colby's granddaughter said to me actually at the restitution hearing, standing in the courthouse hallway, that the people who get taken advantage of by financial predators are almost never the naive ones or the careless ones. They are almost always, disproportionately, the generous ones, the people whose capacity for trust is a genuine virtue rather than a flaw, and that the tragedy of fraud isn't that it exposes some weakness in the victim. It's that it specifically, deliberately targets a strength and turns it into a vulnerability, which means the solution was never trust less. The solution, the one I now build my entire practice around, is trust and verify simultaneously, holding both at once, the way any competent auditor holds both respect for a client's integrity and a professional obligation to check the numbers anyway, not because you assume the worst, but because verification is simply what care looks like when real money and real futures are on the line. Eleanor called me once 7 months after the arrest, a call I almost didn't answer, and when I did, she asked, without any preamble at all, whether I might consider helping the family by not pursuing the civil judgment against Marcus quite so aggressively, framing it, astonishingly, as something that would be good for everyone's healing, a request so perfectly, completely consistent with 6 years of Eleanor prioritizing appearance over accuracy that I actually felt a strange, cold sort of relief hearing it, proof that nothing about her had changed, that I had not, somewhere in the process, imagined the worst of her. I told her, politely, that the civil judgment was a legal matter handled by my attorney and unrelated to any family healing, and I ended the call, and I have not spoken to Eleanor since, though I understand, from the same mutual acquaintance who mentioned the boutique job, that she has recently started telling people the entire situation was deeply misunderstood by the press. A narrative revision I find almost impressive in its total detachment from 412 pages of federal court filings. Priscilla, for her part, reached out to me 9 months ago, not to apologize, but to ask, with what I genuinely believe she experienced as reasonable and not at all presumptuous, whether I might be willing to consult, for exposure, on a financial wellness content series she was developing for her rebranded account. An offer I declined without much comment, though I confess I did screenshot the message and show it to Nathaniel, who laughed so hard he had to put his phone down, because even after everything, even after watching her entire family's fortune and reputation collapse in a single ballroom, Priscilla had somehow emerged with the exact same instinct fully intact, the belief that other people's genuine expertise was simply raw material for her own brand, freely available for the asking. Some patterns I've come to understand are simply too deep, too load-bearing, to be dismantled by a single catastrophic event, no matter how public or how total. I changed my name back 6 weeks after the annulment was finalized, dropping Whitfield entirely, a decision that sounds simple, stated that plainly, but that took me nearly 2 full days sitting at my kitchen table with the paperwork, before I could bring myself to sign it. Because a name, I discovered, carries a strange residual weight, even after everything underneath it has been proven false. I had been Camille Ashworth Whitfield on business cards, on my firm's original registration before I renamed the practice, on the small brass nameplate that used to sit outside my old office at Merrow & Klein, and dropping the second half of that name felt, in the moment, less like reclaiming something and more like performing a small, private amputation, necessary and correct and still, somehow, painful in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. My grandmother's watch, the one I mentioned wearing on my wrist most days, a slim gold Movado she left me when I was 22, became, during that stretch, an odd anchor point, something with my family's actual, verifiable history stamped into it. A 1958 engraving on the back, reading simply, "To E, always H," my great-grandfather's initials to my great-grandmother's, a promise that, as far as 67 years of family record showed, had actually been kept. I found myself touching that watch constantly during the months of legal proceedings, an unconscious habit Dr. Prescott eventually pointed out to me, a small, physical reminder that not every inherited name, not every family legacy, was built on the kind of rot the Whitfields had spent 3 generations quietly accumulating and just as quietly disguising. Richard Whitfield reached out to me only once, 5 months ago, not by phone but by a handwritten letter, an oddly formal gesture from a man I'd never once seen write anything by hand in 6 years beyond a golf scorecard, and the letter, 3 paragraphs long, asked, with what I think was genuine confusion rather than manipulation, why I had turned the family in rather than handling it privately, a question that revealed, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire story, the fundamental gap between how Richard understood the world and how I did. To Richard, an $890,000 fraud against 6 real people, several of them elderly and vulnerable, several of them, like Everett Pruitt, victims specifically because of Richard's own personal vouching, was primarily a family matter, a problem of discretion rather than a problem of crime. Exactly the same entitled worldview that had let him ask me for $11,000 over a defunct marina without a flicker of embarrassment years earlier. I did not respond to the letter. Some questions, I've learned, answer themselves simply by existing, and Richard's question answered itself in the very act of being asked. Agent Denise Okonkwo Marsh and I have stayed in occasional contact since the case closed. An unusual outcome, she told me once over coffee, but not an unheard one, given how directly my professional skill set had contributed to building a case her office could actually prosecute successfully. She's referred 3 clients to my firm in the past year, each one a case with echoes of my own. A spouse or business partner whose fraud had gone undetected, specifically because it operated inside a relationship of trust rather than a relationship of arm's-length scrutiny, and each time she calls with a referral, I hear, underneath the professional courtesy, something that sounds almost like she's still checking on me, still making sure the woman who sat across that bolted conference table 4 months into an investigation, answering questions about her own marriage with clinical precision, is doing all right on the other side of it. I am. Most days, genuinely, I am. I think about the question I asked you earlier, the one about which ledger you've never thought to open, and I want to leave you with one more thing before I go, because I think it's the truest thing I've learned in this entire 14-month ordeal. Truer even than anything about fraud detection or financial red flags or the specific mechanics of how a family like the Whitfields manages to run the exact same con, in slightly different forms, across 3 generations without anyone in their orbit ever quite catching it in time. The truest thing is this: the box my father handed me on that porch wasn't really the evidence. The evidence was just paper. The box was permission. Permission to stop performing a piece I didn't actually feel. Permission to finally ask, out loud, in my own head, the questions I had spent 3 years training myself not to ask. And I think, if there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take with them tonight, it's that you don't need someone else to hand you that permission. You're allowed to open the box yourself anytime you start to feel that specific, quiet, persistent weight in your stomach that something doesn't add up, because I promise you, the numbers were never the hard part. The hard part was always just letting yourself look. The search warrant on the Sable Point office was executed the same morning as the ballroom arrest, timed deliberately, Agent Okonkwo Marsh explained, to prevent any possibility of evidence destruction once word of the arrest inevitably spread through Charleston's tight social circles. I wasn't there for it, obviously, but Agent Okonkwo Marsh walked me through it in detail during a follow-up meeting weeks later, describing how agents found, in a locked drawer beneath Marcus's desk, an entire second set of physical ledgers, handwritten, not digital, a detail that struck me hard when I heard it, because I understood instantly why. Digital records can be subpoenaed, traced, recovered even after deletion, but Marcus, on some instinctive level, must have known that the truest version of his own fraud needed to exist somewhere a forensic accountant like me would never think to look, on paper, in his own handwriting, hidden the old-fashioned way, the way his grandfather might have hidden gambling debts 2 generations earlier. Those handwritten ledgers turned out to be the single most damning piece of physical evidence in the entire case, because they tracked, in Marcus's own hand, the real performance of the fund alongside the fabricated numbers he'd sent to clients. A side-by-side record of exactly how much he knew he was lying by, and by exactly how much, meaning there was no argument left, none at all, that Marcus had simply been a poor money manager who'd made honest mistakes. He had known, precisely, at every single moment, exactly how much of other people's money he was stealing, and had written it down anyway, in his own hand, the same hand that had signed our marriage license, the same hand that had opened a wrapped ring box on the Battery seawall at sunset, 11 months into a courtship built, I now understand completely, on exactly the same kind of quiet, patient, deliberate lie. I want to tell you about the day I walked back into Merrow & Klein, my old firm, 3 weeks after the arrest, to formally hand in my resignation, because the reaction there surprised me more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. I had expected pity, or worse, the specific, awkward, over-careful kindness people extend to someone they consider fundamentally diminished by scandal. Instead, my managing partner, a woman named Deborah Halstead who had trained me straight out of graduate school, sat me down in her office, closed the door, and said, "Camille, I've read the case file, as much of it as became public record, and I want you to understand something. What you built, under the specific conditions you built it under, is some of the most disciplined forensic work I've seen in 26 years in this field, and if you ever decide you want a job here again, the door stays open, permanently." I hadn't realized walking into that meeting how much I needed to hear that my professional identity, the one thing Marcus had never managed to touch or corrupt or borrow for his own purposes, remained entirely, unquestionably intact, that the skill set I'd spent a career building was, if anything, sharper and more valuable for having survived exactly the test it was never supposed to have to face. There is a very specific image that stays with me, more than the ballroom, more than the arraignment, more than any of the larger, louder moments of this story, and it's this. 3 a.m, roughly 6 weeks into the investigation, sitting at my dining room table under that same desk lamp, surrounded by 18 months of bank statements fanned out in careful chronological rows, a calculator, a legal pad, 3 different colored highlighters I'd assigned specific meanings to, yellow for confirmed transfers, pink for suspicious but unconfirmed, blue for cross-reference dates, and outside my window, Marcus's Range Rover pulling into the garage, home late again from wherever he'd actually been, and me, sweeping every single document off the table in 11 seconds flat into a banker's box I kept specifically for that purpose, sliding it under the table, arranging my face into something neutral before he even opened the door. And I think about how many nights I did exactly that. How many times I performed the specific, practiced choreography of hiding my own investigation from a man who had spent years hiding his fraud from me. Two people living in the same house, each running a covert operation against the other, and only one of us, in the end, operating with the full weight of federal law, verified evidence, and genuine moral standing behind us. If you've made it this far with me, through all of it, the box on the porch, the ledgers, the ballroom, the 14 months since, I want you to know that this isn't really a story about a man who got caught. Men like Marcus get caught eventually, or they don't. And either way, that was never really the point I set out to make. This is a story about what it costs to be the only honest person in a family built entirely on the assumption that nobody would ever check, and what it's worth, on the other side, to have checked anyway. There's a final piece of the timeline I've saved for last, deliberately, because I think it belongs here, at the very end, more than anywhere earlier in the story. 6 weeks before the vow renewal, before we'd finalized the FBI arrest plan, before Agent Okonkwo Marsh had even connected our case to Danielle Farrow's Nevada complaint, I sat down alone at my dining room table, late on a Sunday night, Marcus asleep down the hall in the guest room, and I wrote out, longhand, on a single yellow legal pad, a list of every single moment across 6 years where some small, quiet part of me had noticed something wrong and talked myself out of it. It took me 2 hours. The list ran to 4 full pages, front and back, 61 separate entries, the garage phone calls, the $620 jewelry charge, the sudden back pain, the laptop snapped shut at 2 a.m., dozens more I hadn't even mentioned to my parents because they'd seemed, individually, too small to matter. I sat there afterward, looking at those 4 pages, and I felt something shift permanently in how I understood the previous 6 years. Not shame, exactly, though I flirted with shame for a while before Dr. Prescott helped me set it down, but something closer to fury, clean and specific and entirely justified. Fury not at myself for missing 61 small signs, but at a man who had engineered, deliberately, patiently, exactly the kind of plausible deniability that makes each individual sign forgivable, while the pattern, taken as a whole, is completely damning. I kept that legal pad. It's in a drawer in my new office, underneath a stack of current client files, and I take it out, sometimes, when a new client sits across from me, insisting they must have missed something obvious, must have been foolish, must have somehow deserved the fraud that was done to them, and I show them my own 4 pages, 61 entries, written by a professional forensic accountant who still didn't see the pattern until she stopped looking at each entry alone and started looking at all of them together, and something in their shoulders always loosens a little, seeing that. Wanda Ellery told me something during our final meeting on the annulment case that I think about often, a small aside she made almost in passing while we were finalizing the last of the paperwork. She said that in 30 years of family law, the cases that resolved most cleanly, most completely, weren't the ones where the wronged spouse got the biggest settlement or the harshest criminal sentence for the other side. They were the ones where the wronged spouse walked out of the process with a story they could tell themselves honestly, start to finish, without any remaining gaps that self-doubt could later crawl back into. You have that, she told me, sliding the final signed order across her desk. Most people never get that. Most people spend the rest of their lives half convinced they're missing some piece of the puzzle that would have made it all make sense sooner. You don't have that problem. You built the entire puzzle yourself. I think that's the real inheritance from those 4 months. More than the civil judgment, more than the restitution, more even than the firm I built out of the wreckage. I have a complete story, every piece verified, every gap filled, and there is a very specific, very durable piece that comes from that completeness. A piece I don't think Eleanor will ever have. Telling herself the situation was deeply misunderstood. A piece Richard will never have. Still asking why the family couldn't have handled it privately. A piece that requires, first, the willingness to look at the whole ledger instead of just the entries that are comfortable to look at. 6 months after the arrest, I helped organize something I never expected to be part of, an informal support group, meeting monthly in the community room of the Charleston County Public Library, for people who had discovered they were victims of a spouse's or family member's financial fraud, an idea that started small, just me, Marguerite Colby and Everett Pruitt sitting around a folding table with bad coffee, and that has since grown to 11 regular members ranging in age from 31 to 83, each carrying some version of the same story, a trusted person, a familiar name, a pattern nobody thought to check until checking became unavoidable. Marguerite, remarkably, has become something of the group's unofficial matriarch, arriving early every month to set out the coffee. And she told me once, folding paper napkins into neat triangles while we waited for the others, that the group had given her back something the fraud had taken, that even the restitution check couldn't restore, which was her confidence that her own judgment, her own read of a person's character, could still be trusted going forward, one careful, corroborated decision at a time. Everett, for his part, still occasionally runs into Richard around the old marina crowd, and told the group with a dry, weathered laugh that Richard still nods at him like nothing happened, a detail that captures, I think, better than almost anything else in this entire story, the particular durability of a certain kind of denial, the way some people would rather maintain the performance of an unbroken world than ever once acknowledge the specific damage their own choices, or their own silence, actually caused. I drove out to see Danielle Farrow again, 4 months ago, this time not during a layover but a deliberate trip, 3 days in Reno, and she took me to the exact chapel on the Strip where she and Marcus had married 9 years before I ever met him. A small, garish, neon-lit building sandwiched between a pawn shop and a 24-hour diner, and we stood outside it together for a while, not saying much. Two women who had never met each other until a federal investigation connected their separate, decades-apart heartbreaks into a single case file. Danielle told me she'd started her own version of what I do, not professionally, just informally, helping women in her own circle of friends learn to read financial documents, teaching a basic, practical version of the exact literacy that might have let either of us catch Marcus years earlier, and she asked whether I'd ever consider building something more formal out of what I do. A course, a workshop, something beyond one-on-one client work, and I told her I was thinking about it, which was true, and remains true now, sitting here telling you this story, because I think that's ultimately the real reason I agreed to have this conversation recorded at all. Not for the drama of it, not even really for the justice of it, but because somewhere out there, right now, someone is sitting at their own kitchen table at midnight, looking at a number that doesn't quite add up, and telling themselves it's probably nothing, and I would like, if I can, for at least one of those people to hear this and decide, tonight, to keep looking anyway. There's one last conversation I want to give you before I stop, because it happened only 3 weeks ago, and it's still settling into place for me even as I describe it. Solange Marchetti, my very first client, the widow whose late husband's business partner had been skimming profits for years, called me not for a new case but just to check in, something she's done every few months since we closed her file. And near the end of the call, she asked me a question nobody else, not my parents, not Dr. Prescott, not even Nathaniel, had thought to ask quite this directly. She asked, "Camille, do you ever get angry that you had to become this good at finding fraud, specifically because someone committed fraud against you? Doesn't that feel like he still gets credit for the thing you built?" I sat with that question for a long moment before I answered her, because it's a sharper version of something I've circled around in therapy for over a year without ever landing on quite this clean a phrasing. And the answer I gave her, the one I still believe, is that Marcus doesn't get credit for my competence any more than a burglar gets credit for a homeowner installing a better lock. He created the conditions that forced me to develop a specific expertise I might never have needed otherwise. That's true. And I won't pretend that's not a cost. A real one. Months of my life I will never get back. Spent not building a marriage, but excavating the ruins of one that had never legally existed in the first place. But the discipline underneath that expertise, the patience, the refusal to accept the first plausible explanation, the willingness to keep pulling a thread until it either resolved or unraveled completely, that discipline was mine before I ever met him, built over years of training and practice and a childhood spent at a kitchen table, listening to a federal judge explain chain of custody to an 11-year-old. Marcus gave me a reason to point that discipline somewhere I never expected to need it. He does not get to own what I found when I did. I think about the $412,000 sometimes, the specific figure, still, more than a year later, because it was the first number, the one on my father's printed spreadsheet that started everything. And I think about how strange it is that a number that once felt like the entire weight of my collapsing world now sits, filed away, in a case folder in a drawer in an office I built myself. One entry among many, in a much longer ledger that also includes Solange's $211,000 recovered, and the 11 active clients on my current roster, and the 11 library group members who show up every month with bad coffee and better instincts than they give themselves credit for, and a small gold watch on my wrist that still keeps perfect time, 67 years after someone actually meant the words engraved on the back of it. I used to think the box on my porch was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Some days I still think that, but most days now, if I'm honest with you, and I have tried, through every single word of this. To be honest with you, I think it was simply the day I finally got to start using everything I'd ever learned, everything my parents ever taught me, on the one case that actually mattered enough to prove it was worth learning in the first place. I keep circling back even now to that 11-second stretch of videographer footage, the one where I'm standing perfectly still at the back of a ballroom while 209 other people move and gasp and reach for their phones, because Wanda showed it to me once more, months after the evidentiary review, this time not for legal purposes but because she thought, correctly, that I needed to actually watch it as myself rather than as a piece of evidence. Watching it that second time, I noticed something I'd missed the first time through, something small. My mother, 3 feet to my left in the frame, had reached over at some point in those 11 seconds and taken my hand, not gripping it hard the way Marguerite's daughter had gripped hers at the restitution hearing, just resting her palm against mine, steady, present. The exact gesture, I realized, she must have used 1,000 times across her own career, standing beside grieving families in courtroom hallways while a verdict was read, the physical vocabulary of someone who has spent a professional lifetime learning that the moment truth finally surfaces in public is rarely a moment of triumph for the person who uncovered it. It is, more often, simply a moment of exhaustion, relief, and grief, arriving all at once, and having someone's hand there to hold through it matters more than any headline or any sentence a judge eventually hands down. I think about Marguerite Colby's exact words to me in that courthouse hallway more than almost anything else from this entire 14-month stretch. "Don't you dare apologize to me, young lady. You're the reason I get anything back at all." Because I've come to understand that sentence as the actual center of gravity for everything that happened after the box arrived on my porch. This was never really my story alone. It was Marguerite's story, and Everett's, and Danielle's, and the 4 other Sable Point clients, whose names I haven't given you individually but whose losses, totaling roughly $290,000 combined, are as real and as devastating as my own 412. I was simply the one person in that entire web of victims who happened to have the specific professional training, and the specific parents, and the specific stubbornness to trace every single thread back to its source and hand the whole tangled mess to people with the legal power to actually do something about it. I did not save myself alone that year. I built the case that let an 83-year-old widow get $141,000 back, that let a 79-year-old retired shrimp boat captain finally stop nodding politely at a man who'd helped rob him, that let a woman in Reno finally understand she hadn't imagined the specific sick feeling she'd carried for 9 years about paperwork she never actually saw get filed. And I think, ultimately, that's the note I want to leave you on tonight. Not the ballroom, not the handcuffs, not even the specific satisfying image of Eleanor Whitfield folding cashmere sweaters in a consignment shop 3 miles from the house she used to call, inaccurately, the family home. I want to leave you with Marguerite's hands around mine in that courthouse hallway, papery and cold and surprisingly strong, because that, more than any single moment of public reckoning, is what 4 months of quiet, patient, methodical truth-telling actually bought for her, for Everett, for Danielle, for me. Not spectacle, restoration. And I think that's worth more than every single dollar this family ever pretended to have. There's a detail from the club membership termination letter I only learned about recently, through Wanda, who'd requested a copy during discovery for an unrelated matter, and I want to share it because it captures something about how quickly institutions recalibrate once the story around them changes. The letter, addressed to Richard and Eleanor jointly, cited outstanding financial obligations to the club as the official reason for termination, never once mentioning the arrest, the fraud, or the federal charges directly. A careful, lawyered evasion that let the club avoid any appearance of judgment while still, unmistakably, closing the door for good. I found myself almost admiring the precision of it, the same bloodless, procedural efficiency my father had spent a career deploying against people far more dangerous than Richard Whitfield ever managed to be. Evidence that reputational collapse, once it starts, doesn't need drama to finish the job. It just needs paperwork, and enough people quietly deciding, all at once, that the risk of continued association finally outweighs the benefit of the name. I still keep the original manila folder, the one my father handed me on the porch that morning, in a fireproof box in my new office closet. Not because I need the documents anymore. Every relevant page has long since been photocopied, entered into evidence, filed with the court, but because I think, someday, I might want to look at it again, not for facts, but for the specific memory of my own handwriting in the margins, notes I added in the early weeks before I fully understood what I was building, small, tentative question marks beside entries I hadn't yet confirmed, Question marks that, one by one, over 4 months, I went back and crossed out and replaced with dates, amounts, and sources. The physical record of doubt, slowly, methodically converting into certainty. I think that folder, more than the watch, more than the framed photograph of my grandmother on my office wall, is the actual artifact of what I survived. Not the betrayal itself, but the specific, unglamorous labor of turning suspicion into proof. One confirmed line at a time, at a dining room table, under a desk lamp, while the man who caused all of it slept 15 feet away, entirely unaware that the wife he'd spent years managing so carefully had finally started managing him right back. I ran into Colton once, unexpectedly, at a hardware store on Savannah Highway about 5 months ago, both of us reaching for the same shelf of paint samples, and after an initial, awkward beat of recognition, he told me, unprompted, that he'd started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week since the divorce. That it was the first thing in years he'd actually followed through on without anyone pushing him to, and that he sometimes thought about that conversation in Eleanor's driveway, the one where I told him things were tight, as the first moment anyone in that entire family had ever told him the truth about money, instead of simply handing him more of it to postpone the reckoning. I told him I was glad he was doing the work, and I meant it, genuinely, because if there's one thing 4 months of forensic investigation into my own life taught me, it's that the people who eventually do the hardest, most honest accounting of themselves are rarely the ones who were forced into it by a courtroom. They're the ones who finally got tired of being the only person in the room, still pretending the numbers added up. That's where I'll leave it for tonight. Standing in a hardware store aisle with a man who once asked my ex-husband for a bailout and is, slowly, quietly, learning to stop needing one. Because I think that image, ordinary, unglamorous, entirely lacking in ballroom drama, is closer to what real recovery from something like this actually looks like than anything I could show you from that November evening at the yacht club. I want to close this out with one last number because I've given you so many throughout this story. Dollar figures, dates, ages, the specific weight of a wrapped box on a cold porch step, and I think this final one matters most. 14 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. That's how long it's been since my father said, "Don't make a scene," and drove away. Since I dialed 911 with hands that didn't feel like mine. Since a man I thought was my husband stepped into his own kitchen and confirmed, in 4 words, that the family he came from had spent generations building a name capable of absorbing exactly this kind of collapse. 14 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, to go from a woman who couldn't see the fraud in her own bed, to a woman who now runs a firm built specifically to help other people see theirs sooner than she saw hers. I don't know exactly what I expected justice to feel like when this all started. I think some part of me expected it to feel like triumph, like the specific, satisfying click of a case finally closing. It doesn't feel like that most days. Most days it feels quieter than that, steadier, closer to the feeling of finally, after years, sleeping through an entire night without your body bracing for a sound that never used to mean anything, and somehow, eventually, started meaning everything. If you've stayed with me this long, through every ledger entry and every dinner I sat through smiling at people who'd spent years deciding I mattered less than their own comfort, I think you already know the kind of person who watches a story like this all the way to the end, and I think you already know why. So subscribe now, because next week I'm telling you about the client who walked into my office insisting her business partner of 22 years would never lie to her. The same words, almost verbatim, that I once would have used about Marcus, and by the time that consultation ended, we'd found the first $11,000 of what would eventually total nearly $600,000 hidden in an account her partner had opened using her late mother's maiden name. Her late mother's maiden name. I remember sitting across from that client, a marketing executive named Ophelia Vance, watching her face do the exact thing my own face must have done at my dining room table 18 months ago. That specific collapse of certainty into vertigo, the floor of an entire relationship quietly giving way beneath her in real time. And I remember thinking, not for the first time, that every single one of these cases starts the same way, with someone insisting, almost defensively, that this particular person, this specific relationship, was the one exception to everything they knew, professionally or instinctively, about how deception actually works. It never is the exception. That's the thing nobody wants to hear at the start of a case, and it's the thing every single client eventually thanks me for saying out loud anyway, because the exception was never real, it was just the story we told ourselves to keep sleeping at night, right up until the morning somebody hands you a box and tells you, gently, not to make a scene. Ophelia is 3 weeks into her own version of what I lived through, Sitting at her own kitchen table now, I imagine, under her own version of a desk lamp, sorting statements into her own version of yellow, pink, and blue. And I told her exactly what my father told me on that porch. Gather the proof, keep your face calm, and let the proof make the scene for you. Because the moment you let them see your certainty before you're ready, you hand them time to build a story that isn't true. She asked me how long it took me to stop shaking every time I heard his car in the driveway. I told her the truth. Longer than she'd want to hear, and shorter than she'd expect. And that either way, the shaking stops eventually, and what's left underneath it, once it does, is sturdier than anything that came before. And that sturdiness, more than the money recovered or the sentence handed down or the portrait taken off the wall, is the only inheritance from this whole ordeal I'd ever wish on anyone watching tonight. The quiet, hard-won knowledge that you can survive finding out the worst thing, and come out the other side with your own name back, your own ledger balanced, and your own two hands finally steady enough to hold someone else's through it too. So tell me, from wherever you're watching this tonight, whether it's a kitchen table of your own or a car in a parking lot on your lunch break, what's the number you've been avoiding checking, and what's stopping you from opening that ledger tonight instead of tomorrow? I already know some of you are thinking about it right now, and that's exactly where I want to leave you. Not scrolling to the next video, not closing the tab, sitting with it just for a minute the way I once sat with a spreadsheet I didn't want to believe. Because that minute is where every single thing I've told you tonight actually began. And when you're ready, whenever that is, you already know where to find me. Comment ledger one more time for me before you go. I read every single one. See you next week. Every word of it, every last one. Until then, take care of yourselves out there, truly. Good night. For real this time. Bye. Okay, bye!